Blood spread slowly across the marble while 3 imperial officers stood in the doorway and watched her die. They had already told her that the mother she begged them to spare was a corpse by morning. And the man who once promised to cherish her smiled down at the wreckage and wished her farewell. Her own hand closed around the silver blade while his voice called the choice ruinous and called her a fool. But all of it began on a bright, ordinary morning with 2 white birds crossing an empty summer sky. The continent was tearing itself apart that year, and her kingdom bought its peace the cheapest way it could. They sent a bride to the imperial crown prince and called the wedding a treaty stitched into white silk. Her name was Arsinoe Neoparnas, and she carried her roses the way a woman carries a sentence. The whole court called it an incredible rise in status, and she was content to let them believe it. She was a princess in name only, the daughter of a concubine who had once been somebody's slave. The crown prince reached for her hand at the altar and called her his Arsinoe, as though she were precious. They were right, she thought, as his fingers closed over hers. Even she believed her fortune had finally turned. In that first life, standing in the colored light falling through the chapel glass, she genuinely dreamed of happiness. She lifted her face into the warm gold of that afternoon and allowed herself, for once, to hope. Years later, a soldier would hum to himself while walking down a tower stairwell to fetch her, and the prince waiting at the bottom of it would still be smiling, exactly as he had smiled at the altar. She was on the floor by then, bleeding through her sleeve, while his men stood behind him and said nothing. He asked her, almost kindly, whether life was truly so unbearable for the crown princess of the empire. She told him to cut the nonsense, and the chain around her wrist scraped across the cold stone as she moved. He knelt down beside her and said he had come bearing good news, and she looked up at him in pure dread. So in the end, she said, her homeland Parnas had passed entirely and finally into his hands. Indeed, he answered, and thanked her for the intelligence she herself had provided over those years. The secret passage had been especially useful. It led straight into the royal quarters, and her face went white. That damned general had given him some trouble, he admitted, but the man had been wiped out easily enough. She saw a bride under a white veil again, smiling up at a sky she had been foolish enough to trust. And she finally understood that the girl in that memory had signed every single death that came afterward. Then her mother, she asked him. Please. She only wanted to know what had happened to her mother. His face changed then, into the thing she should have recognized on the very first day she met him. He laughed and asked whether she was actually crying, as if the whole thing were a small private amusement. She had always behaved as though she had no feelings at all. Such a rare sight, he told her. She rose on shaking legs, blood soaking through her white sleeves, and said that he would kill her now. Her hands came down on the tile at his feet, and she did not lift her eyes to look at him. She asked him for one last favor, that she be permitted to end her own life with her own hands. With the sacred sword she had carried since childhood, he repeated, still faintly amused by the request. Let her die by her homeland's relic. That was the only mercy she had any strength left to want. Pitiful, he called it, but surely he could spare that much for the woman who had once been his wife. The stone under her was cracked and cold, and the palace above her head already belonged entirely to him. She bent forward over the blade, and for the 4th time in her existence she made the same choice. The silver dagger. She was almost certainly the last person alive who knew what that blade actually did. Every death by its edge returned her to the summer of her 12th year, to this exact room and hour. She had spent 3 whole lives already, and 3 times the same hand had closed around her throat. The first time she tried to stop him, and he smiled patiently through every warning she ever gave. The second time she tried to run, and the forest simply handed her back to him in pieces. The third time she became his spy, and he discarded her the moment she stopped being useful to him. Gray light, red eyes, and a decision made somewhere far below the level of conscious thought. If this 4th life ended the same way as the others, she would take the quiet of death instead. Her hair scattered through the dark as she fell, and all those wasted years fell away beneath her. Sweat, a hammering pulse, and eyes belonging to a woman who had watched her own execution 3 times. Then the light was warm, the floor beneath her was clean, and she whispered that she was back. A child's bed with carved posts, a quilt her mother had chosen from a merchant one autumn. The window stood wide open onto a balcony where nothing had burned yet and nobody had died. She was 12 years old again, in a white collar and ribbon, alive inside a house that still stood. Her bare feet found the rug, and she was moving down the hall before her mind had caught up. The corridor light came through the tall windows and fell in perfect squares across the floorboards. She checked every doorway as she passed it, as though soldiers might already be waiting inside. She took the stairs far too fast, chasing the one person she had never once managed to save. Her feet skidded on the landing, and the sound of her own ragged breathing filled the whole hall. Then the tears arrived, before she had finished deciding whether she was even allowed to cry. She stopped dead, drenched in sweat, terrified of what she would find in the next room along. And a voice she had not heard in 3 lifetimes asked, gently, whatever was the matter with Rusi. Her mother stood there in a green gown, whole and breathing, and entirely unaware of any of it. The girl raised both hands toward her as if she needed proof the woman was actually solid. Warm fingers brushed across her cheek and asked whether she had suffered some kind of bad dream. Her kind, gentle mother, who in every previous life had been dead long before the marriage even began. The royal family had always treated them as unwanted guests, yet this woman had made her childhood peaceful. And then everything came apart at once. In a single terrible season she had now relived 3 times. A plague swept through the palace that year and did not care in the least whose blood it drank. The king lost 8 sons and 4 daughters, one after another, until the nursery wing stood silent. So when the empire proposed a marriage, she was the only royal blood left in the kingdom to offer. She lowered her head against her mother's shoulder and quietly made herself a promise about this life. Her mother smiled down at her and told her to go on and say whatever it was she wanted. The girl looked straight ahead, and her voice came out far steadier than any child's should. Send her to the military academy, she said. She would become a soldier and protect them both herself. The second life had ended under a sky exactly like this one, quiet and thick with summer stars. That night she ran, and the voice behind her howled that she had turned her back on the empire. It broke his heart, he said, standing over her among the trees with a cane held loosely in one hand. She had tried to escape, and she had failed so completely that the memory still woke her 4 years later. He wondered aloud what sort of punishment would ensure that she never left anywhere ever again. She was already apologizing, already saying that she had been wrong, already begging him in the rain. It did not stop the cane coming down, and the sound she made afterward was not a word at all. Then there was sunlight through leaves and the particular silence that means everyone has walked away. They left her out there for days, and nobody told her what he would be bringing back with him. Her hands tore themselves open against the roots, and the blood dried where it fell in the dirt. The pain of split flesh she could survive. She had survived considerably worse than that already. Even the terror of being abandoned alone in the dark was, in the end, only a temporary thing. What truly broke her mind was hunger, repeating one word until it stopped being a word at all. Then Boots came through the leaves, unhurried, the way a man walks toward something he already owns. "Long time no see, Arsinoe," the crown prince said, smiling down at her in his blue and gold coat. She crawled to his feet and begged him for anything at all to eat, in whatever words were left to her. "Of course," he said pleasantly, and crooked one finger the way a man calls for a servant. He had known she would ask for exactly that, so he had brought something along for her. They dropped it on the ground in front of her, and at first she could not make sense of the shape. Then she saw the fall of the hair and the earring in it, and her entire body went still. Her mother lay there on her side, and the blood underneath her had already stopped moving. The sound that came out of her then was not grief yet. Grief arrived a full moment afterward. She fought the chains until her wrists split open, calling for a woman who could no longer answer. He laughed above the noise and told her he had known perfectly well that she would like it. Then he leaned down close to her ear, still smiling, and told her to eat. She looked up at him and found she could not make a single word leave her mouth. She closed her eyes and something inside her quietly stopped belonging to a person. She knelt there with both hands over her face while the whole world went white around her. When she looked up again, her fists were shaking and her eyes had gone flat and gold. One day, she swore into the rain, she would make that man taste this exact despair himself. They dragged her away through the mud while his soldiers watched from under the dripping trees. He asked, almost wounded, whether she would truly refuse his gift and eat filthy worms instead. "Then gouge out her eyes," he ordered, as calmly as a man asking someone to adjust his cuffs. The spears closed in a circle around her, and that was the end of her second life. And she promised him a pain far greater than anything he had yet found the imagination to show her. She woke under a sky with nothing in it but clouds, 4 years later and one whole life away. A bell hung above the roof of a training hall, catching the morning through a gap in the beams. Sunlight came down through the trees and into a wooden room stacked with borrowed books. Someone shook her shoulder gently because she had fallen asleep against the wall again. 4 years had gone by since the day she walked through the gates of the military academy. The dreams of the life before came back to her nearly every night, and she let them come. They were the reason she kept walking down these corridors instead of running away from them. She was 16 now, in a cadet's coat with a 4-petal brooch pinned neatly at her collar. And to kill the man who had bound her into this same cursed circle 3 separate times. For that she needed the strongest sword on the continent, and she knew exactly whose hand held it. The Grand General of Parnas, Walter Heiberg, a name every soldier in the yard said carefully. She had no intention of serving him. She intended to become the one that he served. But first there was the training yard and an instructor asking whether anybody here had legs. "Geronimo!" he bellowed across the sand. Even a great-great-grandmother would outrun that pace. Bandel would soil his trousers before he ever reached the latrine at this rate, he added helpfully. 20 laps in, the cadets could barely stand, and the man barely counted it as a warm-up. A lichen and a human, one of them wheezed, were surely not supposed to run at the same speed. Someone told her she had that murderous look in her eyes again, and asked if she had dreamed badly. The instructor promised that the last one in would spend the night roped to the academy bell. Afterward, the yard was full of collapsed bodies, and she sat on the step and watched them breathe. This special training, one of them groaned into the dirt, was simply torture with a printed schedule. "Who put a wolf in charge of it?" the red-haired one demanded, and then noticed the silence. She hid her mouth behind her hand because lichen hearing is genuinely, famously ridiculous. The instructor tilted his head down at them from a direction none of them had thought to check. "Still," they whispered, "the man was famous. Direct adjutant to the Grand General himself." Geronimo Rast swore that if it were true, he would do 100 more laps on his hands. Then he saw the look on everyone else's face, and the sweat started running down his own. "Drugged up," the instructor repeated very quietly from directly behind his shoulder. "They took that drug so nobody got hurt," he said, "because a full moon amplifies what they are. Without it," he added pleasantly, "they could tear something like Geronimo into pieces on the spot. 3 days locked away and dosed to the eyes so that nothing goes berserk. Was all that clear?" It was extremely clear. Even the cat-eared cadet in the corner had stopped moving entirely. Then came the announcement, and the whole room forgot about its aching legs at once. That afternoon, the Grand General himself would be delivering a lecture inside the Academy Hall. Her friends waved her over to the benches, calling out the short name everyone used here. Why sit alone at the very edge, they complained, and she told them they were far too loud. She sat down anyway, and something behind her ribs began beating much faster than it should. Because to her, the man about to walk through those doors was not a legend or a story. The hall filled up. The lectern stood empty. Every cadet in the kingdom leaned forward at once. And the doors at the far end of the corridor caught the low afternoon light and held it. In her first life, the Crown Prince had asked about this man, wearing a smile she still remembered. "Lure Walter Heiberg here by any means," he had said. "Drag the wretch in at the cost of your life." He was the only person alive who had ever made that prince taste anything resembling defeat. If not for Walter, the kingdom of Parnas would have fallen years before it actually did. And none of this marriage nonsense, the prince had murmured, would ever have become necessary. So the man might well be the beginning of everything that had ruined her 3 times over. Invincible commander, national hero, the entire strength of a kingdom folded into one body. But he was also the single card left on the board that could bring all of it to an end. The Heibergs were an iron-blooded warrior house, and their crest was 2 crossed swords over a shield. But even among that family, one name had come to burn considerably brighter than all the rest. He left the academy early and made brigadier general younger than anyone in the army's recorded history. At 22, he crushed the Lycan rebellion so completely that the crown made him a grand general. Combat, tactics, decisiveness, command. There was not a single column in which he was not superior. And then there was the blade at his hip, said to drive anyone but its master into a screaming death. "So that was the sword," she murmured, watching him from the upper gallery of the lecture hall. He introduced himself as Walter Heiberg, commander of Central Command and the Black Eagle Battalion. The cadets around her whispered that he was supposed to be enormous and genuinely terrifying to look at. Instead, he looked far less like a soldier and rather more like an unusually handsome scholar. She pressed her hand flat against the desk in front of her and told herself firmly to focus. He would take their questions, he said, so long as none of them touched on classified matters. Someone asked whether the magic sword was truly cursed, and someone else asked about the royal guard. She barely heard a word of it because she was already deciding how to take that man for herself. How, she thought, watching him answer them. How exactly does a person make a man like that hers? Walter operated on principle, so she needed his favor first, and a reason for him to remember her. Then a blue-haired cadet raised his hand and asked about the Lycan serving as the general's adjutant. He had been promoted for killing the Lycan leader. Were his own Lycan soldiers really fine with that? Who in the world, she said out loud from the gallery, asks such a spectacularly foolish question? That leader had been a criminal long before he was a Lycan, hoarding phantom herbs to drive prices up. So why, Walter asked the room quietly, should a criminal's race enter into his punishment at all? Then he stopped, because someone up in the gallery had said it half a second before he did. 400 heads in that hall turned around toward the girl leaning on the wooden rail. She realized far too late to do anything useful about it that she had said all of it out loud. He looked up at her from the lectern and his expression did not change even slightly. He was not sure, he said, how a mere cadet had come to be aware of classified information. But she was correct. His soldiers had known the man's crimes, so there had been no unrest at all. Furthermore, the premise was flawed. Once you enlist, your identity is soldier and nothing else. Anything that threatens the kingdom is an enemy, human or Lycan, and anyone who aids it is protected. That was the military law of Parnas, he told them, and 400 cadets answered him as one voice. She hung over the gallery rail afterward, watching him gather up his papers on the floor below. Cadet Arsinoi, he called up to her, and she turned around again very, very slowly. He would like a word with her, he said, if she happened to have a moment to spare. They walked out together into a corridor full of hot afternoon light and empty of witnesses. They had never once met in person before. So how, she wondered, did he already know her name? He stopped where the wall opened out onto the garden and waited until they were properly alone. His hand rested on the sword at his hip, and the whole courtyard seemed quieter because of it. She had spent 3 entire lifetimes learning what men wanted before they ever said it aloud. But nothing she had learned in any of them prepared her for what he did next. He inclined his head toward her, there in the empty corridor, and addressed her as Princess. She stared back at him and asked how on earth he could possibly know who she was. How could a man who serves the royal family fail to recognize her, he said, sounding genuinely puzzled. Even inside the palace itself, she told him, almost nobody had ever recognized her at all. He had met Lady Ancilla days ago, and her mother was worried, because the army was a dangerous place. She thanked him for the concern and told him this was something she fully intended to handle herself. Real combat was many times harsher, he warned, and to him she was plainly a 16-year-old greenhorn. So she asked how many princes and princesses the royal family currently had. 10, he answered. And of those 10, how many had not been born of a queen consort? 1, only ever her. Her mother was a concubine who had never even been granted a proper name by the court. A woman forbidden to leave the detached palace, living out her years in a lavish, comfortable birdcage. He said nothing for a moment, and the wind moved through the garden hedges between them. If she went back, she said, the cage would simply become hers. She had come here to learn instead. Regardless of her birth, he answered, she remained a member of the royal family of Parnas. She asked whether he truly meant those words, and he said without a doubt that he did. Then she asked if he was loyal to that royal house, for as long as he lived, he said. Something in her face softened, and it was the first honest thing she had shown anyone in years. Good, she said quietly. She sincerely hoped that loyalty of his never wavered. Because when every other royal is dead and only she remains, his loyalty will have nowhere left to go. He watched her the way a man watches a door he does not remember leaving open behind him. He understood why she had left the detached palace. But why a soldier, he asked, of all things? Because she wanted the chance to work alongside him, all the better to make him hers. And why exactly, he asked her, would a princess want to work alongside a soldier? Because he was destined to become her guardian, she thought, and did not say a word of it. Because he was so very admirable, she said instead, smiling into the yellow flowers beside them. He tilted his head and said, with what looked like genuine confusion that he supposed that was so. This day, she told him before he could leave, "Please be certain that you remember it." "Of course," he answered gravely. "And she should be certain to remember it as well, Princess." She watched him walk back toward the hall and let the smile slide off her face entirely. Then he would look forward to seeing her again after her graduation, he said, and bowed. The day he takes up that sword called Dawn, she thought, and uses it to wring that bastard's neck. Graduation came 4 years later, and the dormitory windows emptied out one shutter at a time. He sat by the window with his chin propped in his hand, waiting for her to answer the door. She was at her desk with a pen and a white blossom that somebody had left lying there. When was she leaving the dormitory, he asked. Soon. He was going straight back to his own territory. Geronimo had wanted to be a soldier more than anyone, until his brother's accident made him an heir. Fewer than 30% of graduates ever actually enlist, she told him, and he laughed it off. And what about her? He asked. Why on earth was she going back to the palace of all places? She had been top of the class for 4 years. She had been offered a commission in tactics. She looked out through the little window panes for a while and did not answer him immediately. There was something waiting for her at the palace that she needed to do herself, she said. She meant to take her mother out of that detached palace and hide in the north for a few years. His Majesty would never allow such a thing, Geronimo said. She agreed entirely. She was sneaking out. Pomnos, he guessed. Freezing, absurdly far, nobody around. She said he had learned something after all. He told her she was the craziest person he knew, and she said she felt exactly the same looking at him. They laughed together like two people who did not yet know how little time was left to them. Make it work, he told her at the door, and contact him the moment everything was settled. She took his hand in both of hers and told him that they would certainly meet again. 6 months later, in a hall lined with nobles, a man in a monocle called the council to order. The king of Parnas was dead, then the crown prince, then the princes, the princesses, the queen. The plague she remembered from 3 separate lifetimes had arrived exactly on its schedule. Only 2 survived, one paralyzed in tongue and legs, the other blind, and neither could ever rule. So every powerful man in the kingdom turned toward the same question at the very same moment. Were they truly planning to leave the throne of Parnas standing empty like this indefinitely? Everyone present understood the royal line was broken. Then Walter said that it was not. Duke Godelkyle looked up from the head of the table, and the whole room went quiet. Who, he asked into that silence, could possibly be left alive to inherit anything? Arsinoe Thea Neoparnas, 5th princess of the realm, the daughter of Lady Ancilla. Who? The Duke repeated, in the exact tone of a man swatting an insect off his sleeve. Ancilla was a concubine of slave origin, they muttered. A dancer's daughter who never learned governance. That was enough, Cale said. He understood Sir Heiberg's intention, but the girl was wholly unprepared. Then Walter asked one question. The candidate they meant to choose, was it a regent or a king? Nobody around that table wanted to be the man who answered that particular question out loud. He laid one hand flat on the wood, and somehow the gesture was worse than a drawn sword. They should think carefully, he said, and recall Article 1 of the Royal Army Service Creed. We pledge loyalty to the Royal House of Parnas, 400 voices had shouted in that training yard, and devote all our strength to its protection. Every man in that room had once said those words. Sir Heiberg, one of them, began, and did not manage to get any further than the name. He walked out between the red carpet and the white columns without waiting for anybody to vote. In the corridor, a woman with a painted fan stopped him and asked whether the meeting had ended. After he left, it had been absolute chaos, she said. Marchioness Vanessa Rutherford enjoyed chaos. Then who, she asked him, tilting the fan, could possibly be his lord in a room like that? None of those present were fit to be king, he answered, without any particular heat in it. She laughed out loud and asked why not, since they had all wasted such effort on the question. He considered her question seriously, which was always the most dangerous thing about him. 50 dying refugees or 50 cattle for your own citizens, he asked. Which would she choose? The cattle, obviously. Exactly, he said. Politicians seek profit, and they never choose loss. A king takes the refugees, orders his vassals to find more cattle, and turns the refugees into farmers. A king embraces and protects everyone, even when it costs him time. That was the king's road. And that concubine's daughter could do that, the Marchioness asked. Yes, he said. That is correct. She hid her mouth behind the fan and did not tell him a single thing she was thinking. Cale would reconvene the council in a month, she warned him. He was quietly gathering soldiers. She would take no side in any of it, she added. She only hoped the whole thing ended peacefully. To recommend a woman for a throne without ever asking her will. How reckless of him, he thought. It had already been a full year since the two of them crossed paths by chance in Pomnos. He wondered what she might be doing now, and then the obvious answer caught up with him. Far to the north, snow was falling through the pines onto a figure crouched down in the drifts. Caught again, she said, without any real surprise, brushing the frost out of her hair. Then she dropped off the ridge into all that white, and the mountain swallowed her whole. She opened her eyes on a stone floor that smelled of salt, old straw, and other people's misfortune. How, she wondered, did she end up in a cell every single time? And whether word had reached her mother? A voice bellowed her name through the bars and informed the entire block that it was time to eat. Last time it had been smuggling, the bearded prisoner across the way said. What was it this time? Hardly smuggling. She had only helped a few refugees along. He asked if she meant thieves. Lichen refugees, she corrected him. And yes, she had been paid, though nowhere near enough to matter. He said it was unbelievable that anybody would interfere on behalf of those wretched lichens. Their fate was to be trapped inside the Empire and die there. She asked how anyone survives that. Ships full of lichens fleeing the Empire drifted into Pomnos harbor almost every single month. The trouble was that Pomnos belonged to the Rafi, avian folk who counted lichens as sworn enemies. A pink-haired girl huddled down in a boat beside her mother, whispering that she was frightened. The way those people clawed toward some other life reminded her far too much of herself at 12. Those creatures were guilty simply for being born, the old man spat. Monsters, unfit for any company. Then surely, she said sweetly, he ought to want her shipping every last one of them abroad. Peace, he snorted. Acting as a broker was against the law, child. She said that she knew. She had meant to wait quietly for the king's death, and instead became known as the lichen's benefactor. Someone was coming to vouch for her identity, the guard said, and for heaven's sake, stay out this time. A guarantor, she repeated slowly. She could not think of a single person it might possibly be. And then she could think of one, and every trace of color went out of her face. 2 polished boots came down the corridor at a pace no jailer in that building had ever used. That was quick, muttered the old prisoner, peering out from behind his wooden partition. It had been a long time, said Walter Heiberg, and he addressed her through the bars as Your Highness. Her house sat in a valley town under a white mountain, the last place in the world anyone would look. Her mother had gone up to the nursery, she explained, where she looked after the Rafi children. Surely, she said, pouring the tea, he had not come all the way out to Pomnos merely for her sake. He set the cup down without drinking from it and let the silence do a little of the work. Seeing her safe put his mind at ease, he said, and she realized it truly had been for her. A year ago, desperate and newly a criminal, she had asked the soldiers to fetch her anyone at all. Anyone at all had turned out to be the Grand General of the entire kingdom of Parnas. It seemed she was still aiding the lichens, he observed. It had simply turned out that way, she said. She had said the same thing last time, he noted. She wondered how many such moments he had catalogued. How was the palace, she asked. Nothing unusual, she hoped. Well, he said, who can really say? Dauphine and Antibasila were preparing for war, and the sparks might fall on Parnas for no reason. Did she truly worry for the country? She was still a citizen of Parnas, she answered, exile or not. He studied her across that little table the way a man rechecks a sum he has already done twice. Then he asked her the question he had crossed a frozen half of the continent in order to ask. Had she given no thought at all to returning to Parnas? She blinked at him over her cup. His Majesty the King, he said, had passed away 10 days ago. Half a year earlier, a strange illness had begun spreading quietly among the high officials. The king, the crown prince, every royal prince in the palace. All of them had gone down with it. And for that reason, he said, setting his cup aside and rising from the chair. He went down on one knee on her borrowed floor in a fisherman's house at the edge of the world. They wished to proclaim her the 19th sovereign of the kingdom of Parnas. She did not sleep at all that night, and the sky over the roof went from pink to gray. The plague had arrived 2 full years earlier than it ever had in any life before this one. It was cold in the room, and she had absolutely no idea what hour it had gotten to. She got up off the floor and went to the window, because something outside in the yard was moving. A blade came down through the dark and split a log clean in half in a single stroke. The man swinging it was stripped to the waist in the middle of a Pomnos winter night. Did he not feel the cold at all, she wondered. Was that thing down there even a person? The king was dead. The royal family was wiped out. She had prepared measures to worsen the illness. She had simply never once imagined that all of them would die this quickly and this cleanly. Her plan had been to take the throne 3 years from now, not in the middle of this winter. By then, Parnas would have been caught in a 3-kingdom war and the crown badly weakened. The disease had ruined the whole schedule, and yet somehow she had won Walter over anyway. Down in the yard, he lifted the axe again, entirely unbothered by the fact that she was watching. She came out with a teapot in both hands and asked what exactly he was doing at this hour. They were short on firewood, he said. She pointed out that the axe was over there. He was aware. He would catch cold out here, she said, and wondered how much longer she could keep lying to him. He had trained in colder places than this without any issue, he replied. She should not worry. That was not what she had meant. She asked, smiling, whether he would please put on some clothes. Morning came white and blinding over the little town beneath the church on the hill. She handed him a cup out in the snow and told him it would warm him up soon enough. No matter which way she looked at him, the man simply did not seem like a soldier at all. Was it really all right, she asked, to leave a sword that precious lying out in the snow? She reached for the small blade beside the bench, and it moved before her fingers ever closed. The sword had returned to him entirely on its own. The most useful of his small tricks, he said. Did he happen to have any others? She asked, and he considered how much of it to tell her. He touched the blade to a boulder half his height, and the boulder simply left the ground. Then the light around his hand turned violet, and every single thing inside it stopped moving. He could temporarily halt objects or living creatures around him, he explained perfectly calmly. With that, she said, he could charge an enemy camp alone and take a commander's head at leisure. Unfortunately, the range was 3 meters and 5 seconds was the limit. She called it broken anyway. She had no foundation and barely any legitimacy, she said, so what was his real reason for choosing her? He looked away from her first, which was not a thing she had ever expected him to do. He said he rather liked her illegal activities, and then apologized for being bad with words. She had been helping lichens in the city of Laffy for over a year, quietly, at her own expense. A king embraces and protects all of them, and endures losses for the sake of a right future. Was that really all, she asked? If she thought that was barely anything, he said, all the more so. He had seen the makings of a wise king in her, and would devote his life to proving it true. If he liked her, that was enough. He was a sword she had intended to obtain regardless of the reason. She warned him that he would not be able to back out later, even if he came to regret all of it. He said that he understood, and she stood up in the snow and told him they should try. They stood together on the frozen ground with the whole ruined plan finally beginning to move again. Make absolutely sure that he protected her, she said. He was the only person she could trust now. One day, she thought, looking up at him, this man would become the sword of her revenge. Autumn arrived at the capital, and the council chamber filled up for a second time that year. A month goes by so terribly fast, the Marchioness observed from behind her painted fan. Duke von Witten asked Lord Rutherford not to slip quietly out of the room again this time. Rumors of the chaos had reached the neighboring nations, and no further delay was possible now. The man in the monocle smiled at the head of the table and simply let them all argue. Then a servant at the door announced that the main guest of the evening had arrived. Their intentions were already leaning heavily in one direction, and every man there knew it. Sir Heiberg, the Marchioness murmured across the table, what exactly are you planning to do? Since everyone was finally present, Duke Kale said, they might as well begin the business. The door swung open, and Walter stepped aside to let somebody else walk through it first. Red heels crossed that carpet one deliberate step at a time, and nobody said a word. It was the first time they had greeted each other like this, she said. A pleasure to meet them all. Who exactly is that? Someone whispered, and half the table turned around in their chairs. She had grown so much that he almost failed to recognize her. And was Lady Ancilla well? A subtle jab at her mother's origins before she had even been offered a chair to sit in. Ancilla, they murmured to each other. The concubine's daughter. Then it could only be one person. Duke Guddle-Kyle, whose trade through the strait earned very nearly as much as the crown itself. Legitimate heir of a great house, a noble among nobles, whose moods even the late king had watched. Which was also, she thought, looking at him, precisely the place where he could be broken open. She apologized for appearing without notice and said she had gathered her courage to speak here. Bringing the Grand General along with her, Kale noted, suggested the matter must be significant. It might be a rather blunt statement, she warned. Considerate generosity granted the young, he said. She let the whole room look at her for a while, and she did not hurry a single word. The throne had stood empty so long that administration was paralyzed and diplomacy was running late. Such arrogance, somebody hissed, from a girl raised in a detached palace nobody ever visited. She folded her hands in front of her and waited until the muttering ran out on its own. They must have struggled deeply over whom to crown, so she wished to offer her own humble opinion. Very well, Kale said, smiling. Who did she think most suitable? Go on, say your own name. In her opinion, the person in this room most befitting the throne of Parnas was Duke Kale, she said, and the man in the monocle forgot entirely how to keep smiling. The Duke's hands came apart on the table, and for one whole second he was simply a startled old man. Outside the windows, the capital went about its afternoon, unaware of what was being decided indoors. 4 of the greatest names in Parnas sat very still on their red chairs and waited. Princess, Walter said quietly from behind her, what she was saying amounted to. He did not finish that sentence because she had planned every word of this day's in advance. She lowered her head so none of them could see her face while she counted slowly to 3. That was only true, she added, if the Duke could prove he was not the one backing the Empire. Backing the Empire, the Marchioness repeated, and her fan stopped moving in midair. His imagination was quite wild, Kale laughed. She would retract that outrageous remark at once. She was not slandering him. The timing was simply poor. There was the matter of the Port-Mayor Strait. Lycan slaves conscripted by the Empire had been flowing through it into Dauphine for many months. Dauphine was at war with Antibacilla, and Dauphine had almost no military strength of its own. And yet Dauphine had provoked that war first. Did nobody in this room find that at all strange? Was she saying the Empire stood behind the whole thing? Yes, she said. That is exactly correct. What utter nonsense, Kale shouted, and every person there heard the crack running through it. For 2 years in Pomnos, she had helped Lycans seek asylum, and they had fled the Empire and Dauphine. Pomnos was a Rafi city, and the Rafi answered to the Grand General. Confirmation would take days. The Duke had built an immense fortune on a sea route agreement signed with the Empire itself. And he had never once bothered to hide how thoroughly pro-Empire his sympathies actually were. If he took the throne now, every court on the continent would call the new king a puppet. And the prestige of the royal house would be dragged straight through the mud alongside him. He could simply nullify the agreement, he snapped. Could he? She asked, on speculation alone. So what conclusion, he demanded of her, was she actually trying to reach in front of these men? She wanted the Duke as her guardian until things stabilized. Until then, she would hold the throne. So she intended to become king, he said, making the words sound like a child's game of dress-up. And one more thing, she said into the noise. She happened to know the cure for the plague. Could she truly cure that disease? Yes. And it would help the Marquise's daughter as well. The Marchioness went entirely still, because that daughter was upstairs at home and still dying. So what did they say? She asked the room pleasantly, and looked at nobody except Kyle. Would he stand firmly behind her? Her smile was the single most dangerous thing in the chamber. Get angry, she thought, watching him. Get angry at me for daring to challenge your noble authority. Support her, he said, and the shadow across his face swallowed everything except his eyes. His fist came down on the table. Her words were speculation, and now she claimed a cure as well. Not one scholar had ever found a way. Was this simply a lie told in order to seize a crown? She had clearly said she knew the cure. She would share it only with those who supported her. That was ridiculous, a noblewoman gasped from the far end. Was the girl threatening them all? She let her eyes travel slowly around that entire table before she gave them any answer. A threat, she said. It seemed they had all forgotten exactly who she had walked in here with. Grand General, she asked, who is my father? His Majesty, the late King Visimontius II. Nobody in the room breathed because every one of them understood what was coming next. Steel slid free of its sheath and rang once against the marble floor of the chamber. Do you acknowledge me as king? She asked. The dawn will light your Majesty's path, he answered. She walked back across the carpet through the falling petals without hurrying even slightly. The Duke watched her go and understood precisely how badly he had just been played. He must have known it the exact moment he allowed himself to lose his temper in public. She smiled at nobody in particular, and it was the smile of a woman 4 lifetimes old. She gave them 1 day. Anyone who would stand against her legion should leave this place tonight. Tomorrow, at this same hour, she said from the doorway, she hoped to see them all again. He waited for her at the foot of the great stair with the chandeliers burning above them both. She stopped in the doorway of the quarters he had quietly given up in order to house her. If he gave her his rooms, where exactly would he be staying? He told her not to worry about it. He turned his boots back toward the corridor and said it was here that he would leave her. He would return before the sun had set. He did not say a single word about where he was going. He walked out, and she stood alone in the middle of a room that had gone suddenly very quiet. She almost called him back, and he half turned around in the doorway to look at her. Never mind, she said. She would see him later on. He should go and get some rest. Later, sunk to her chin in hot water, she wondered how long it had been since her last bath. And then, inevitably and against her own better judgment, she started thinking about him again. She could not work out what that man was actually thinking, and that was the entire problem. She had expected an earful for acting without consulting him. He had not asked a single question. In 2 previous lives, they had called him the dog of the Parnas royal family, and meant it. A dog that carries out its master's orders faithfully, whatever those orders happened to be. She stared at the little potted plant on the table and could not decide if that was good news. She was still standing there with her chin in her hand when the shouting started outside. "Grand General!" somebody bellowed down the corridor, loud enough to rattle the window glass. She turned toward the door, and the peace of that particular afternoon ended for good. She came out with wet hair and flushed cheeks and found a complete stranger standing in the room. A man with cat ears froze in mid-shout, and she said his name before he could bolt for the door. It had been a while, she said pleasantly. Did he happen to remember her from the academy? Of course, Jen said. The kid from the academy, Arsino. So what exactly brought her out here? The Grand General would be back very soon, he added, and she said that she would wait for him. He had been moving around alone these past few days, she remarked. Had something happened? There had been a full moon, Jen said. He was never much use for 3 days around one of those. Ah, she said, the full moon. She filed that away with everything else she had been collecting. Then she asked what was in his pouch because something in there smelled extremely strange. He turned out a pretty stone with gold dust in the grain that might fetch a decent price somewhere. That was it, Jen said, suddenly bolt upright. That was exactly where the smell had come from. A dragon's tailbone, apparently, though the man who sold it had very obviously been a swindler. They were a delicacy among lichens, he told her, with a look she found deeply concerning. It was a fake from a market stall, she assured him. There was no possible way it was real. He ate the thing anyway, and the noise he made afterward was not a noise a person makes. Then he stretched, blinked twice, and looked at his own hands as if they belonged to somebody else. She watched all of it with the very specific attention of a woman discovering a brand new lever. The door of the room opened at what was objectively the worst possible moment. Sorry to have kept her waiting, Walter said from the threshold. Dinner would be. He got no further than that, because his adjutant launched himself bodily across the room. Walter caught him by the collar in midair without changing his expression at all. You are here, she said, and then corrected herself into something considerably more formal. Perhaps, she thought, that throw had been a little much. He had brought the man back regardless. He asked whether Jen had come about the paperwork and told him to go back and rest instead. She caught the adjutant's sleeve on his way out because he was grinning at her like a conspirator. That stone she had, he whispered. If she was not using it, she should give it to the general. Why exactly? She asked him. He said she would get to see something genuinely interesting. Consider it payment for the bone fragment, he said, and she decided that she liked him. The doors closed behind him, and the room was suddenly a great deal quieter than before. He apologized on behalf of his adjutant, who was still not quite himself after the full moon. If anyone had been rude, it was her, she said. And about that title, when the two of them were alone. He said that he could not, flatly, without a single second of hesitation anywhere in it. He was not comfortable enough. He could not commit insubordination. Please take the words back. She looked at him for a long moment and decided to tell him something that was almost true. She had been a concubine's daughter, then a princess, then a crown princess of the empire itself. and then a criminal executed on a stone floor, which taught her exactly what all of it was worth. Back in that meeting room, she asked him had she come off as an enormous snob. Be honest. He said she'd been a little straightforward, which was the kindest possible way to phrase it. She intended to stay that way for tactical reasons, but keeping it up was genuinely exhausting. So off-duty, she said, she wanted to relax a little, and perhaps he might consider it too. He stood there like a man being ordered to disarm himself in front of an armed enemy. She waited, and for once in her 4 lifetimes, she did not push the matter any further. He would consider it, he said at last, and they should probably go and eat their dinner first. The clock tower caught the very last of the light over the gardens below the window. When would the palace lockdown be lifted, she asked. Not until the plague was entirely gone. Then the inconvenience was his, she said, since he was the one who had lost his own quarters. He did not answer that, and she watched the last of the light move across the window glass. Duke Kale was a proud man, he warned her. Provoking him could have unpredictable consequences. She had already wounded that pride badly. The seats would simply be emptier tomorrow morning. He turned to look at her, and something in his face was not entirely soldierly anymore. Your Majesty, he began, and then found that he had nowhere in particular to go with it. Not Your Majesty, she said, and he shut his eyes like a man in genuine physical pain. Kale was a shrewd elder and a seasoned politician, he continued. He would not be easy to handle. And if he walked out, nobody would be left to unite the independent lords. Yes, Walter said. She stood at the window while the curtains went gray around her and the garden disappeared. General, she asked without turning around, if they fought Duke Kale's knights, would they lose? Do not worry about it, he said, almost smiling at her. They would certainly win that fight. That was all she needed to hear. The rest they would work out after tomorrow's meeting. Then her stomach growled loudly, and she asked whether they should perhaps go and eat first. The next day, a herald announced Lady Arsinoe at the doors of the council chamber. As expected, Duke Kale refused to acknowledge her as king, and his chair at the table sat empty. Those who had walked out would be branded traitors and punished, she told the remaining lords. Before that, the Marchioness said, she had a question, and she already knew what it would be. She had prepared for this the night before, down to the exact number of people in the room. A gloved hand pushed the tall gilded doors open behind her without waiting for permission. Soldiers in black and gold came down the stairs carrying something heavy between them. She had prepared a gift in advance, she said, and the count of them matched perfectly. The soldiers set the trays down on the carpet, one for every single lord still seated there. The Marchioness looked at the sprig of green leaves and red berries and did not touch it. This herbal medicine would cure the disease, Duke Witten repeated. How was he supposed to trust that? Try it first and then decide, she said, and the woman beside him stopped breathing for a second. Could she really save her daughter? Completely cured within 2 months, she answered evenly. Then she held out a small metal flask across the table toward a waiting gloved hand. What exactly was that? Somebody asked, and the entire room leaned forward in their chairs. This liquid was the cause of every symptom, she said. It must never be used again by anyone. The noise around that chamber was 100 cosmetics jars being remembered all at once. She had known this since her second life, and had waited years to say it inside a room like this. Perhaps this was how the late king died, she said. He drank it, calling it an elixir of immortality. And the rumor about that elixir had been started originally by the first queen consort herself. Who could they possibly blame, the Marchioness said bitterly. She should have stopped her own daughter. Everyone was the same, Walter thought, watching the wealthiest men in Parnas go pale together. The Marchioness rose out of her chair before the meeting had properly been brought to a close. A servant lifted the silver tray with its little sprig and its neatly folded note upon it. That same night, in a tower across the city, a hand rose in the dark and did not come down. The castle stood quiet under the stars, which is how the worst things generally happen. Someone was standing at the foot of that tower who had absolutely no business being there. Blood spread out across the floorboards from a body dressed in blue and red silk. That wench! Duke Kale snarled at his own window. He should have ruined her years ago. Far away, an arched door opened onto a night sky, and a room with a shield hung on the wall. In the yard below, soldiers ran drills through pouring rain, counting the cadence as they went. He was training even on a day like this one, she observed from the window of the study. They trained every single day, he said, in preparation for entirely unforeseen circumstances. Rain training was the worst of it. damp, sluggish limbs, blurred sight, and she remembered all of it. She had clung to a cliff face in weather exactly like this, in a life he knew nothing about. Her ears stung, the way they always did, just before she said something she should not. Why? He asked without turning around from the window. Did she have something she wanted to say? It was an order, he added, so she admitted she had been thinking about the medicine again. It clearly worked, he said. He did not doubt that at all. He was simply curious how she knew. As a child, she was summoned often by the queen consorts, and their faces began to look wrong. Pale and smooth, but not in any healthy way, like porcelain that had been left out in the rain. She remembered the mirror, the maids, and the little bottles arranged in a row like soldiers. What was that? She had asked. Something vulgar people like her and her mother would never afford. Though the woman was so jealous of vulgar pale skin that she painted poison onto her own face. Gradually, the other princes and princesses went pale as well, and so she looked the matter up. It was an infamous illness in the Northern Empire, and steam made every symptom far worse. And she was the one who had quietly spread the new fashion for steaming among the palace women. She smiled a little at her own reflection in the dark glass of the study window. A hand came to rest on an envelope lying beside a service revolver on the desk. He had news to deliver, he said, and asked her to listen to it without being surprised. On hearing she was to be proclaimed king, the third prince had. She said she already knew. She had known about it long before that message ever left the tower it came from. The third prince had murdered the fifth and then thrown himself from the top of the tower. He had been her worst enemy, so she was not particularly sad, and pity would be ridiculous. He apologized for speaking thoughtlessly. The royals were handled. Now there were only the lords. She came and stood beside him at the window with the rain running steadily down the glass. Her hand closed slowly at her side and the palm of it had already gone red. She felt no guilt whatsoever for people who had cursed her and her mother for an entire lifetime. Now she would never again have to look at any one of those faces for as long as she lived. More importantly, she said, brightening all at once, he had called her Your Majesty again. She was going to have to punish him for that, she said, and watched him process the sentence. He turned around, and for the first time she saw the Grand General genuinely at a loss. He asked her to repeat that, in the voice of a man who had misheard an artillery order. Walter Heiberg, she said, sitting up straighter in the chair. Come here to me. He crossed that room the way an experienced soldier crosses an unmapped minefield. Your hand, she said, and he gave it to her because he did not know how to refuse her. He closed his eyes as though bracing himself for something considerably worse than this. Her fingers turned his palm over and pressed something very small into the middle of it. Two little stones sat there, catching the lamplight through their pale gold-veined grain. He stared at them, then at her, and the entire chain of command briefly stopped functioning. This had better be genuinely good, she had thought when Jen first suggested the whole idea. She had not expected the look that was now spreading across the Grand General's face. A bribe, she explained to him. He asked very faintly whether she had said a bribe. If he promised never to say that damned Your Majesty again, then the stones were his to keep. Both of them, she added, and he was actually considering it, seriously, over a pair of rocks. The most feared soldier on the continent weighed her offer with total and complete gravity. If he did not want them, she began, and he said at once that he would obey her command. She stepped back through the doorway and permitted herself one entirely private moment of triumph. Walter Heiberg, 28 years old, Grand General of Parnas, hobby apparently, collecting rocks. She had done all this so they could be comfortable, she said. An order would defeat the purpose. He closed his fist around the stones very carefully, as though they might bruise in his hand. Thank you, he said. He would treasure them both. And then he called her Rusi. She turned her face away from him and did not entirely manage to keep it neutral. He told her not to worry about headquarters and that the palace would be reorganized soon. That was not at all what she had meant by busy, and she let him discover that himself. He would find out soon enough, she said, and left him standing there in the window light. 2 days later, somebody came screaming down a corridor of the Gothic palace at full speed. They had an enormous problem, Jen shouted, and took a door off its hinges getting through it. What was it this time? Walter asked him, without bothering to look up from his desk. A letter, Jen said. Wiz had just brought it in, and Jen had already read it twice himself. He read it through once in a library that had gone completely and thoroughly silent. He set it down, and his face did not change, which frightened Jen far more than shouting. The Duke was declaring an independent state. Jen howled at him. Why was he this calm about it? Then a pair of heels stopped in the corridor, in front of a door now lying in two pieces. "Hello there, instructor," she said brightly, and Jen tried to bow while holding half a door. "Had he told her about it already?" Walter asked. Yes, Jen admitted he had done exactly that. Then he told Jen to show Her Majesty proper courtesy, and Jen made a truly heroic attempt. "It was not important," she said, waving it off. Now, what was this about an independent state? Kale was declaring independence with 3 other lords and uniting the whole West into a nation. They had told the crown not to interfere any further. She said that could not possibly be right. A man who gave his entire life to this kingdom does not simply change his mind in a fortnight. This was a formal proclamation, she said, turning it over. Where exactly had it come from? The captain of the 1st Reconnaissance Unit, delivered to every lord directly, bypassing the ministry. She had known Kale was gathering soldiers for months. She had, in fact, been counting on it. Independence, and not rebellion. On paper, the word sounded almost reasonable to a neutral lord. But a man with troops enough to found an entire nation would simply have revolted instead. Sacrifice the flesh in order to break the bone. That was the old fox's way of doing things. First, you take a loss in a shockingly foolish manner, and you let your enemy relax completely. Then, the moment the opening appears, you tear out their throat without any hesitation at all. She asked when exactly she was to move her residence into the royal palace. In about a month. Then announced, she said, that the coronation would be held to coincide with that move. There was no need to actually prepare a coronation. She only needed the proclamation to travel. That seemed quite unusual, Jen said afterward, and forgot her title again in the same breath. For someone that young to outmaneuver Duke Kale with words alone, he simply could not picture it. Walter walked ahead of him down the corridor and did not say anything for several paces. She had hesitated perhaps 3 seconds before issuing that order. She was entirely without fear. In his whole life as a Lycan, Jen said, he had never met anyone so unsettlingly wise. Even he felt like a child whenever he spoke with her. And then he saw his commander smirk. Far to the west, the sun went down over a vineyard and an old weathered brick tower. A hand closed around a fistful of dark soil and let it crumble slowly back down. Duke Kale knelt among his own vines like a man paying a visit to close family. Another bountiful year, he said to his son. They should get some decent wine out of it. But the most important ingredient was time, and the patience to let a thing properly mature. If that was true even of wine, he said, with his eyes closed against the last of the light, then what little whelp on this earth dared to covet a land as precious as this one? "Father," said Atland, son of Kale. A document had just arrived from the royal palace. He read it aloud among the grapevines while the sky turned violet behind the two of them. The plan had been to lure the woman to the founding ceremony and take her prisoner there. And then to strike the palace with the troops already waiting. Kyle only smiled at his son. Far away, a girl in black and red stood alone before a throne nobody had crowned her on. "Would Her Majesty care to look around the audience chamber?" the steward asked, holding the door. The vaulted ceiling went up and up above her into blue glass and hanging chandelier light. She walked out into the middle of it in a white dress and stopped where the light fell. It was still a little untidy, he said apologetically. It would be perfect before the coronation. It looked good, she told him, and did not say a word about what she was actually seeing. Because she had stood in this room before, in a life where they dragged her through it in chains. Somewhere in that hall, a man in furs had once sat on a throne and refused to look at her. Father, she thought. She knew he had ordered them to kill her and bring only her mother back. But he was the one who died in the end, and she was the one who walked back in alive. Would she care to go further inside, the steward asked. No, she said. This was quite enough. She had already seen everything that she had come into this room to see. Whoever ends up sitting in that seat, she thought, standing beneath the great rose window. That night, the house on the hill went quiet under a sky absolutely crowded with stars. General, she called from the doorway of the drawing room, and then stopped where she stood. A man she had never met before was standing beside him with a leather folder under his arm. He had white hair, violet robes, and a pair of wings folded neatly behind his shoulders. This was Captain Wisbomdaman, who would handle Her Majesty's escort and all her movements. Pleased to meet her, he said, with a bow calibrated to the exact acceptable minimum. That face of his did not look very pleased at all, she observed to the room in general. "Whis," said Walter quietly. "Show proper respect." The captain gave his rank and nothing warmer. The Titmouse Corps was the Royal Guard, and its Rafi division was not publicly known to exist. It was her first time meeting a Rafi anywhere in the capital, she said, watching him carefully. Had she met one before then? Of course she had. She had lived up north for 2 whole years. Really. Pomnos had been quite livable, she added, probably because it sits so far to the south. Pomnos, he repeated, going completely still. She had been living in his own hometown. He was from Pomnos as well. Then it was even nicer to meet him, she said. Jackpot. If they came from the same place, that was practically family. He asked if she was serious. She had lived near Mount Wynnum and sold smoked trout and malt mushrooms, quite profitably too. Why would anyone live out in Ankabun? He laughed. Because the sunsets there are worth it. Her mother still cared for Rafi children in that same village, she added, watching his face. The captain's careful professional neutrality was coming apart at every visible seam. Then something surfaced in his memory and his whole expression changed at once. 2 years ago, someone with honey-colored hair out of Parnas walking the snow roads alone. Was Her Majesty perhaps that lichen smuggler his own mother used to talk about at home? No, said Walter flatly. His Majesty helped the lichens. That is correct, she agreed at once. The captain looked from one of them to the other and reconsidered his entire afternoon. Did the Rafi not despise lichens? She asked. Of course, he said. Vile, uneducated brutes. That, she said, smiling at him across the drawing room, is precisely the reason why. For the sake of Pomnos, she had personally shipped every last one of them off to another country. So her real goal all along had been to drive them out, he said, very slowly indeed. Wisbomdaman, eldest son of Chief Oban, pledged from that day to serve her with all his heart. Walter said nothing at all, which she counted as the loudest possible form of commentary. She was sorry for the lie, but right now she needed the strength of the Rafi far too badly. Days later, they reported that Kale was moving troops near the capital. Around 2,000 men. That was odd. He was not a man to start anything with 2,000. There were hidden forces. Every Rafi unit had searched the mountains and the tunnels and turned up absolutely nothing. The captain spread his hands, because a duchy of open plains hides nothing from the air. She sat back in her chair and let the two of them finish being confident about it. It seemed, she said at last, that they did not know what Duke Kale's greatest weapon really was. Where did they think smuggled goods were usually traded? Portmeyer Harbor, Walter answered. On the ships, Wiss said, and the floor shifted underneath all 3 of them at once. Inside the holds, she said. 2,000 on the roads and every other man of them still at sea. At Portmeyer that night, the water slapped the piers and the lamps burned all along the front. Beyond the trees, a house sat dark under the stars with one single window still standing open. A figure with blue hair bowed its head in the deep shadow beneath the eaves of that house. On the cliff above them, armored soldiers stood out in the rain and waited for a signal. Back in the capital, the garden gate stood open onto a long path of white stone. She was out among the trees at an hour when queens are generally supposed to be asleep. A map lay unrolled on the grass beside her, weighted down at all 4 corners with stones. She had fallen asleep over it, chin on her arm, in the very middle of a war. Somebody reached down out of the dark and took the map out from underneath her hand. There you are, she murmured, without bothering to open her eyes to check who it was. He crouched down to move 2 white flowers out of the path before he sat beside her. She was quite good at finding him, he said, both in Pomnos and again here tonight. Not very many people knew about this particular path, she answered, looking up through the trees. Her fingers tapped the old boards of the bench where she used to hide as a small child. This was the path to Lady Ancilla's detached palace, he realized, the one the court refused to use. Should he order it removed, he asked, and she laughed until she had to cover her mouth. He always went straight for the most extreme option available, and she genuinely liked that. Then the laughter faded, because tomorrow was the coronation and neither of them was fooled. He would handle the pursuit of the Duke himself, he said. She should stay here and rest. She was the king. It would hardly look right to leave everything to her Grand General. So she turned to him under all those stars and used his name without the rank attached. He waited the way he always did, as if her next sentence might be an order to die. She smiled at him, and it was not the smile she kept for nobles and council chambers. The next evening, Boots crossed the red carpet toward a palace lit gold from every window. The lawns filled with carriages and courtiers who had all recently rediscovered their loyalty. To think the coronation was tomorrow, she said. It was finally starting to feel real to her. Was she worried about it, he asked, and she kept looking out into the gathering dusk. He was dressed for something other than a ceremony, and both of them knew exactly what. She told him he genuinely looked like a northern nomad, and he received it as a field report. They could still call the whole plan off, he said. Her operation had far too many uncertainties. What was the worst that could happen if she got caught? She said. She would simply die. It was not fine at all, he answered her, and then somebody knocked hard at the door. A Rafi with purple hair bowed so violently that he nearly struck his head on the frame. He announced himself as Napari Hoya of the 8th Squad, and Jen immediately started shouting. Preparations were complete, and then Jen noticed exactly who else was standing in that room. What an extremely loud entrance, Wiss observed from the corner, as vulgar as he ever was. The two of them were at each other's throats within 4 seconds, exactly as she had been warned. Attention, said Walter, and both of them corrected themselves like guilty schoolboys. Was the deployment complete, he asked. Yes, Jen reported, without a single hitch anywhere. Was it truly all right to show common soldiers a royal secret passage? They would worry later. The lamps came up in the study while the last daylight drained out of the tall windows. A chain rattled through a gloved hand, and the Rafi took a firm hold of the other end. Jen was granted interim command of the Golden Eagle Battalion and swore to manage it properly. Wiss was to follow the plan, but Her Majesty's safety came before every other part of it. Even if it meant disobeying her directly, he was to evacuate her the moment things turned bad. She pretended not to hear that, and he pretended he had not said it in front of her. Kale would certainly come to her coronation, she had told him, so she would take him herself. In return, she needed Walter to secure the single most important card in this entire operation. He had stood at that window for a very long time before he gave her any answer at all. Since she had called it a favor, he said, then he had to ask her one thing first. Whether Rusi would be safe even when he was not standing beside her. Please tell him honestly. Purple wings opened wide against a sky going orange above the rooftops of the capital. A chain snapped taut, and a man dressed in black was hauled straight up off the balcony rail. He looked out toward the coast where the entire thing was going to be decided tonight. Until the sword returns, he thought, watching the light drain slowly off the water below. The chain jerked hard, the wings beat once, and the two of them were gone over the wall. Below him, the ropes went tight against the stone, and his men began to climb them. She could not guarantee it, she had told him, but she would try. He was so terribly persistent. To prioritize her life over the success of his own mission. Not bad, she thought afterward. Then she closed her eyes on the balcony with the whole sunset burning behind her. Far out over the black water, a shape crossed the stars, towing a man along on a line. He pointed down toward the lights burning on the coast, and the wings above him turned. Port Meyer Harbor, Duke Kale's own territory and the only place those ships could possibly be. It was dangerous, Napari said. They needed to go further inland before dropping him at all. No, they were infiltrating the Duke's ramparts directly tonight, from the air above them. Descend, he ordered, and the Rafi obeyed because nobody argues with a voice like that. He fell through the dark with the harbor lamps rushing up very fast to meet him. He hit the wall running, and a sentry bird scattered off the parapet into the night. A boot came down on the stone without making very much noise at all in the dark. A guard turned around into a shadow that had definitely not been there a second earlier. Who goes there? The man managed to say, and then the whole courtyard was moving at once. Someone got as far as the word intruder before a blade went straight through him. Light flared red across a face, and the alarm never quite made it up the stairs. 3 more of them came down the ramp, and 2 of the 3 stayed down on the stone. What was the worst that could happen if she got caught, she had said. She would simply die. He tightened his grip on the sword and started moving through that castle considerably faster. The capital slept under a violet sky, red roofs and towers, and not one single lamp out of place. Inside the cathedral, the throne stood waiting at the far end of a floor of purple tile. And behind one pillar, a winged man sat on the ground guarding a king that nobody could see. He jolted awake out of a yawn and immediately looked extremely guilty about the whole thing. He had gone to enormous trouble to hide her, he hissed, and she began making noise at once. Was she not on edge herself, he asked her? Well, she admitted after a moment. A bit. Honestly, he had never once heard of a plan this reckless. She said the Grand General agreed. Was the Duke actually going to show up tonight? That was, in the end, the entire question. They would see soon enough, she said. It was only 3 o'clock. They should both calm down. Then she noticed the pendant at his throat, and the pale blue stone set inside it. Her eyes fixed on the thing with an intensity she normally reserved for her enemies. He looked down at her, waited a while, and eventually gave up on his own dignity. She could have simply said that she wanted to touch it. Was she really that obvious? It never dropped below a safe body temperature, he said, so she could stare all she liked. Without it, would he really collapse from the heat? Central heat was brutal for a Rafi. The stones cost as much as diamonds, and there were only 12 Rafi in the entire legion. Who would risk their life relying on a pebble that small, she said, and he agreed entirely. Then she asked him why he was here at all, a chieftain's son who prized his own freedom. If he had stayed in Pomnos, he could have lived an easy life and never seen a battlefield. He looked away toward the dark end of the hall and did not answer her straight away. It was really nothing important, he said. It mattered, she told him, so tell her anyway. Then a runner came in at a dead sprint. 4,000 to the command post, 4,000 here. 8,000 in total, exactly as she had projected. And the civilian routes were all clear. Good, she said. Everything just as they had planned it. Lure them all the way inside the palace. Her eyes were entirely steady, which by this point frightened even her own guards a little. Godalkale was clever, but he would lose the moment he chose to fight her directly like this. Jen, she said, turning toward the pillar, go out there and cause as much chaos as you can. He went down those stairs grinning with every single tooth that he had in his head. This was their moment, he told his soldiers. Fight like everything in the world depended on it. 1 rack of lamb for every enemy they put down, he added, and the whole yard erupted at once. Near the capital port, a great ship lay at anchor with a cold wind coming off the water. On the deck, an old man swayed on his feet, and one of his officers caught him by the arm. Dizzy, Kale muttered, pressing a gloved hand hard against his own forehead. The vanguard should already be clashing with the command post. Everything was unfolding as intended. Advance, he ordered them. They absolutely had to reach the palace before the sun came up. A soldier bent to help him down the plank, and the whole column began to move inland. Winning a war depended entirely on how well everything had been prepared beforehand. He had let the Rafi scouts spot 2,000 men on purpose, and she had swallowed all of it. The moment they entered the palace, they would release dream incense and put the lichens to sleep. His officer objected, and Kale pointed out that they had almost no lichens of their own. The man coughed once into his gauntlet and said nothing whatsoever after that. White smoke came rolling over the palace walls, and somebody inside shouted the word incense. 3 lichen soldiers broke and ran across the courtyard with their sleeves over their faces. Catch them, the armored men shouted and poured in through the gate after the runners. Everyone inside, Jen roared, protect his majesty. And the trap closed exactly as designed. Captain, one of his soldiers whispered through a sleeve, were the 2 of them actually. Performing this well, Jen whispered back. At this rate, he was going to lose a fortune in lamb. Less talking, he added under his breath. Keep falling back and make it look expensive. Boots came through the smoke at the far end of the corridor, moving in no particular hurry. Damned dream incense, Jen muttered, his eyes gone gold above the cloth across his face. Covering your nose bought 10 minutes at best, so they would finish inside those 10 minutes. Filthy lichens, somebody screamed, swinging hard at a wolf who was no longer standing there. The armored man hit the floor and his sword went sliding away across the polished tile. Armored men flooded into the cathedral beneath that vaulted ceiling, hunting one girl in white. The tiles cracked under 100 boots and the purple light shook along with them. Your Majesty, Jen shouted, staggering in through the nave with smoke still on his coat. They were coming. Well done, she told him quietly. Now hurry up and take cover somewhere behind me. Lamb chops, he mumbled happily to nobody, and let himself be dragged in behind a pillar. Weiss looked down at the half-conscious lichen with visible and entirely electrical contempt. Hey there, Cotton Ball, Jen said from the floor. Now it was his turn. What was he stirring up? It was not trouble, Weiss told him, and threatened to fry him alive in a cauldron for it. Jen went down the stairs sideways, screaming the whole way, entirely and deliberately on purpose. Who exactly was barking orders at whom? Weiss called after him, adjusting one glove. They got along so well, she observed. Weiss asked in what way that resembled getting along. Children always grow up fighting, she said serenely. In time they would become closer. He said that he would pass on that and took hold of the chain with both hands. Then a shout went up outside. They had found her. They had found the fake princess. She stepped out of the shadow of the pillar and let all of them see the white dress. Behind her, a pale ear and a strand of violet hair stayed exactly where they had been. So they were calling her the fake princess now, she thought, watching them come. They came at a full run, because someone had promised a reward for killing her first. And then the light behind her opened out into two enormous white wings. The entire front rank stopped as though they had run straight into a stone wall. Even to their eyes, she asked them, holding the chain that was already lifting her. Did she really look to them like a fake? 40 armored men stood there in the nave of the cathedral with their mouths hanging open. She was running, somebody yelled. Bring archers. Catch her before she reaches the roof. Surrender now, one called up, and he would spare their lives. She should think it over. Truly, Whis muttered above the wing beats, this woman had a heart made out of steel. She had broken the ceiling glass specifically for this, so what was there to be afraid of? They came down together on the ramparts at the very far edge of the palace wall. He set her down on the stone and took a moment to steady his own breathing. 3 men in red knelt on the wet flagstones and paid their respects to their king. Their commander had brought them up here hours ago, through a gate nobody was watching. Every watchtower light was out except the single one by the gate, exactly as she had ordered. 2 heavy barrels sat under the parapet where nobody below had thought to look for them. She folded her hands and waited while the courtyard below filled up with Kyle's soldiers. Seal off the palace, she said, and raised one hand above the wall. Far below, a man in a red coat looked up at the towers and understood nothing yet. The great gate stood between its 2 watchtowers with the sky going black above it. A hand lifted, and all along the wall the archers rose up silently out of the dark. 2 of them crouched down behind the stone with the barrels sitting between them. The whole rampart filled with red coats in the space of a single indrawn breath. Bowstrings came back in the rain, and the light from the gate caught every arrowhead. Below in the gardens, 8,000 men were still moving toward a building with no exit. The first arrow went up out of the dark trailing fire behind it. She drew and loosed with the flame wrapping around her hand, and she did not blink once. Something very bright crossed that courtyard far faster than anyone below could follow it. What was that? One of them said, in the last calm second that any of them would have. A purple-armored officer looked up into the rain, and his whole face changed. And then the castle lit up from the inside, all at once, from end to end. Enemy forces had appeared. Someone was screaming below. Reinforcements? From where? Take cover, an officer roared, and not one of those 8,000 would leave that courtyard whole. Up on the wall, 3 bows drew as one beside a girl in a plain white dress. Isolate the enemy and break their morale. That was all she had to do until Walter came back. Your Majesty, somebody called along the rampart. The Raffi squad was finally coming in. Wings came down out of the black sky directly above the burning courtyard. Whatever they dropped fell through the rain in a long and completely silent arc. A body lay still on the flooded stone below, and nobody went anywhere near it. Fire, she said, lifting her hand above the parapet one final time. And the castle underneath her went up exactly like a lamp being lit in a dark room. Your Majesty, Wish shouted at her through the smoke. Was she safe up there? She was fine. They had assaulted people whose lives depend entirely on their feathers. Once this was settled, she added, she would open the medicinal spring baths of the palace. 2 grown soldiers looked at one another with the expressions of extremely delighted children. Down at the gate, Cale was screaming at his men to force the thing open at once. The flames made it impossible to get anywhere near it, and his officer said exactly that. Above them all, she watched her own trap close, and the man beside her said nothing. Weeks earlier, the sun had gone down over that same vineyard and its old brick tower. 2 men walked slowly between the rows while the light turned the whole field to gold. That woman meant to use the founding ceremony to stir up unrest and then strike the palace. Atlan listened with his head down, exactly the way he had listened his entire life. And now she was crowning herself the same day she moved in. She must be in quite a hurry. He had it wrong, Cale said. When he became king, that would make his son a king as well. But his brother was still alive. Atlan protested quietly. How could he possibly take that? Aegon already had the duchy, a wife, children, an ordinary, comfortable life. He had agreed to it. The young man touched the blue stone at his throat and did not say anything at all. His kind son, shunned by the world his whole life simply for being born with one eye. My lord, a soldier screamed at him. The fire had scattered their soldiers completely. They had lost contact with the 4,000 sent to Central Command. Even the scouts were gone. What did that mean? Cale roared at him. How could a garrison overpower 4,000 men? Unless the palace had never once been defended by anything but a single Lycan squad. Then another runner came. A massive force was advancing up the forest road from the capital. The trees along that road moved and kept moving for a very long time indeed. His officers turned to look at the gate and understood that they were already surrounded. How had Command's army arrived this fast? Someone shouted. Battle formation. Prepare to engage. Up on the ridge above them, a white-haired archer drew his bow back and held it. Then the sky came down on top of them, and the courtyard filled with falling steel. Counterattack, an officer bellowed. There were too many of them. There were far too many. Something enormous came at him out of the light, and he had time to look surprised. Men fell in the street all around Cale while he stood there in his fine embroidered coat. Hooves came up the stone road, and the fighting parted itself for a single rider. The messenger knelt in front of him, and Cale did not move to take what he was offered. A gloved hand finally reached out and took the folded letter from the man's fingers. To her esteemed Duke Cale. Did he not think this little rebellion had gone quite far enough? Was she mocking him? He screamed. Even if he died here today, he would never surrender. Kill the messenger, he ordered, and behind him a blade came sliding out of its sheath. Duke, said a voice from above him. If he did not want to regret this, he should stop now. He turned around very slowly, already knowing, the way a father somehow always knows. Atland, he said, looking up at the shape crossing the dark sky above his head. A masked man held his son off the ground with a blade laid flat across his throat. Put his son down, Cale howled in a voice with nothing of a duke left in it. The young man hung there in the rain and did not struggle against the blade at all. Please, the duke said. The word came out of him with no dignity remaining anywhere in it. Felter Heiberg looked down from the wall and asked him the only question that still mattered. Would he surrender and spare the boy, or resist and stand there and watch him die? He should already know perfectly well which way this particular tide had turned tonight. The Grand General waited, entirely willing to stand up there on that wall all night. Father, Atland was saying through his teeth, he was sorry. He was so terribly sorry. And in the end, before a tower and a plane full of his own dead, Cale gave it up. The sky above the capital cleared, and it was all over before the sun was properly up. Meanwhile, at the far end of the royal family's secret passage, stood a deeply unimpressive shed. Her Majesty, Wiss said faintly from the doorway, had an extremely strong stomach for this. She was grateful there was anywhere to hide. He was a soldier. Surely a little dirt was fine. Being a soldier did not require handling filth, he said. He especially despised insects. Oh, really, she said, and pointed down at the floorboards. Look at that, a cricket. A grown Raffi captain crossed that shed faster than she had ever seen him move in his life. She waved the thing at him and enjoyed herself considerably more than a monarch strictly should. He looked like he was about to punch her, she observed. He notably did not deny it. Seeing one again brought back old memories, she said, and he asked what memories exactly. Had he ever eaten one himself? Please, he said from the far wall, stop teasing him. She was not teasing him at all, and something in her voice made him stop moving. In a forest in another life, a starving girl had eaten absolutely whatever moved. And she had promised the man who put her there that he would taste the same despair. Then somebody knocked at the shed door, and every trace of the joke went out of her face. Come in, she said, smiling at a door she could not see through. So who was standing behind it? Her hands shook so badly that she could not finish the sentence, because she already knew what was inside the box. I told you, the Crown Prince said gently, while the tears ran down her face and she covered her own mouth. Get away from her, she was saying over and over. Get his hand off her, and he only went on stroking her hair. And somewhere behind those red eyes, a woman quietly promised herself that she would kill him for it. But that was another life entirely. This one began in a dusty shed at the end of a royal secret passage. Come in, she said, smiling at a door she could not see through, with her hand already near a blade. The board swung open, and daylight came into that shed for the first time in several hours. How had it gone? She asked, and the man standing in the doorway was still catching his breath. The Duke had admitted defeat. The Grand General had taken him and the hostage back to headquarters. They had won, Wiss said. Your Majesty has won. And nobody in that shed entirely believed it yet. She let herself smile properly in the warm light for the first time in 4 separate lifetimes. Then she lay down flat on the wooden floor and told the two of them to wake her in 2 hours. She was asleep before either of them worked out how to argue with a sleeping monarch. And in the dark behind her eyes, the third life came back to collect everything it was owed. 2 years earlier, inside the imperial palace, the servants had been preparing a birthday banquet. 2 maids in black stood in a room full of chandeliers, arguing happily about the guest list. A hand smoothed the roses pinned into her hair, and she sat very still while they worked on her. She touched the necklace at her throat and told herself that this life was going to be different. How could anybody possibly be this beautiful? One of the maids sighed at the mirror behind her. Did she think His Highness would really come? Of course. He had promised to be there on time. She smiled at that, because by then she had learned precisely how much his promises weighed. By the way, she said, she had not seen Lumi anywhere today. The cat was probably out in the sun. The tall carved doors along the corridor stood closed, and that whole wing was oddly quiet. She sat by the window in the empty room, listening for a set of footsteps she recognized. She bent to smell the tulips, and for one moment she was almost an ordinary young woman. "Happy birthday, Arsinoe," said the crown prince, standing there with an armful of flowers. She had thought he would not come to the banquet today. He asked why she would think that. It was his beloved consort's birthday. Where else in the world would he possibly want to be? When he had asked her to tell him about the secret passage of Parnasse, she had turned him down. Perhaps, she thought, leaning into him, she had spent all these months worrying over nothing. Then a hand set a dark blue jewelry box down on the velvet directly in front of her. "And what was this?" she asked. "Open it," he said. He was quite sure that she would like it. Her heart was beating far too fast, and she still could not have told anyone why. Her hands lifted the lid of that black and gold box while he watched her face very closely. Somewhere in the same palace, a small cat lay on a bed with her paws tucked underneath her. Red light came through the slatted shutters and threw long shadows across the bedroom wall. He leaned down over the chair behind her and waited patiently for the sound she would make. He had heard his consort was so heartsick that she spent all day fussing over that animal. Her fist closed on the embroidered cloth of her gown and began very slightly to shake. He had said he would ask nothing else of her, if only she told him about the royal secret passage. He stroked her hair while she screamed, with the patience of a man who had all the time he needed. She had become king this time for exactly one reason, and it was to take his head off his shoulders. She had seized the Master of Dawn, the strongest blade on the continent, and made him entirely hers. In the dream, a hand closed in her hair and pushed her face down against the floor again. And then somebody was reaching for her shoulder, and the hand belonged to somebody else entirely. "Walter," she said, surfacing out of it. Ah, it had been a dream. He said she looked very pale. She lay there a moment longer and let her breathing come back down to something like normal. She was on a couch, in a clean white dress, inside a room she did not recognize at all. They were at the residence of House Heiberg, since neither the palace nor headquarters were fit. They had pushed the enemy out of the city and imprisoned Duke Kale. He had worked very hard. He sat in the carved chair beside her, looking like a man who had not slept in 3 full days. She would handle the rest, she said. His training meant he could go days without sleeping at all. She looked at him and thought about how many lives she had spent learning to read men like him. "Please sleep a little longer," he said. She had a slight fever, whether she felt it or not. "Really," she said, touching her own forehead. She felt perfectly fine as far as she could tell. No, she did not. She had held on to him through the whole night and refused to let go. She had what? She said. She had been in thin clothes for hours, he added entirely calmly. She stared straight ahead and considered whether a fever could kill a person through embarrassment. He leaned down over the couch and put one hand very carefully against her shoulder. It was the gentlest thing anyone had done to her in 3 lifetimes, and she froze completely. "This would not do after all," he said. "Please excuse him." And then he simply picked her up. A hand drew the pale curtains across the window, and the whole room went soft and dim. She watched him through the gauze and could not think of one single useful thing to say. So the King of Parnasse fell asleep in the arms of the sword she had come back to obtain. There had been so many things he wanted to say to her, and just as many that he wanted to ask. Instead, he laid a blanket over her shoulders and sat down in the chair beside the bed. Still, seeing her unharmed filled him with a relief he had absolutely no intention of explaining. She woke up feeling, she said, as though she had been reduced to roughly 4 years old. Might he ask, he said, where exactly those 2,000 palace defenders had come from? They had not been soldiers at all. Common folk, borrowed quietly from houses Rutherford and Ross. If a real battle had started, it would have been obvious in minutes. But Cale was a calculating man. She had trusted that he would never gamble while he believed himself outnumbered 2-1. Impressive, he said, and with almost no losses on their side. She had his respect and his gratitude. He truly hated receiving compliments, she noticed, and filed that away with everything else. Still, he added, please refrain from such dangerous moves. He had been uneasy the entire ride back. A hand smoothed her hair back from her forehead, and for a moment she was somewhere else. That worthless bastard, she said out loud. He asked her very carefully to beg his pardon. A vile rat, she said. Whatever it took, she fully intended to see that man dead. Had she just woken from a nightmare, he asked, watching her face in the gray window light. No, she said. She had only remembered a man whose death she had been wanting for 3 lifetimes. She rather wished she had woken up a little later. And why exactly was that, he asked her. Because that man once gave her a magnificent gift, and she meant to crush his skull with the box. He did not know the whole story, he said, but it sounded as though her enemy had shown himself. Indeed, one day, without fail, she was going to take that man's head off his shoulders. She need not act personally, he said, and her hand closed slowly on the bedsheet. Her enemy was also his enemy, so he would be the one to bring that head back to her. Just give him the name, he said, and the whole room seemed to hold still around them. She sat up in the bed with her heart beating far too hard for a woman with a fever. He would kill a man for her sake, she said, and he asked whether she was feeling unwell. Walter, she said, and her hand came to rest flat against the front of her nightclothes. Who on earth had taught him to tempt people like that? Hearing him offer made her want to marry him. He asked her to pardon him, and she watched the color climb steadily up the back of his neck. With a face like his, she added, and told him to leave now if he did not want to be kissed. The carved door shut behind him considerably faster than a grand general ought to retreat. She slid down off the bed onto the floor and sat there grinning at absolutely nothing at all. Saying he would bring her that man's head. Just hearing it soothed something very old inside her. But not yet. There were people to secure first, and others who must not be allowed to flee. Only one person alive was permitted to kill him, and this life was going to be her last one. For the time being, Cale had been removed, and with the tiger gone, the fox was going to move. The fox would go straight for the throne, and exactly 2 candidates fit that description. When the second trap was finally set, she thought, that would be another matter entirely. For now she should sleep, because she was completely and utterly exhausted down to the bone. Most people believe a war is fought blade against blade in a field on a bright, clear morning. But anybody who has truly lived through one knows the real battles are fought on paper. Agreements, cooperation requests, proposals, statements of support, and reports without any end. There was no room left in the study to stack any more of it, and Wyss had started to sweat. Grand General, he asked into the canyon of paper, would he perhaps like some tea brought in? No, thank you. If he spilled it, that would simply create more trouble than the tea was worth. Don't mention it, Walter said. If he was bored, he could sit down and help with the stack. They needed to appoint a new administrator soon, he added, deliberately changing the subject. A janitor, Wyss repeated. Godel Cale, assigned to sweep the northern temple of the royal palace. Lords value their honor above their own lives. Would executing the man not be considerably simpler? Walter tilted his head, and something in that movement made Wyss wish he had stayed quiet. Humiliating, he said. He had once thought that sentence far too mild for a traitor. It seemed their perspectives on the matter differed rather more than he had previously assumed. Let it serve as a warning to every noble house that is watching to see what happens next. Oppose His Majesty's rule and be ready to become a custodian at any moment of any day. He understood now, Wyss said quietly. His own judgment had been extremely shallow. 2 hands tied a white ribbon carefully into place at the collar of a formal coat. She had said today's assembly would decide something significant, so he would go to her now. Down the corridor, Boots crossed the floor toward a room full of roses and red curtains. And the man who walked into it wore white and gold, which is not the uniform of a soldier. The White Palace stood against a clear winter sky, and for once nothing in the city was burning. Inside, the great reception hall filled up with every noble house that still mattered in Parnas. Lord Witten pressed a handkerchief to his face and pretended that it was only the heat. Yes, the Marchioness said brightly. Her daughter was already preparing to rejoin society again. A girl who had been so frail was back on her feet in under 2 months, and she owed a debt. If he was that impressed, Witten said, perhaps that was why the king had extended a hand to him. Common folk are not goods to be traded, he added, and yet she handed them out like coins. When Her Majesty declares she will restore order, the Marchioness said, how could she sit still? So she had staked the lives of her own citizens on it. She had received an assurance, she said. Not a single hair on their heads, to fall for such honeyed words. He had grown rather lax. And he, she replied smoothly from behind her fan, seemed to have grown remarkably narrow-minded. He was well aware of the friction between her and Duke Cale. Everyone in that room was. She had sided with the king purely to obtain the medicine, she said. What else could she do? He only wished she would maintain the dignity befitting a lord, and she had no words for that. Truly, she was relieved to hear it, she said. She had felt guilty leaving only him out of it. He was burning inside, she thought, watching him retreat, and she was in no hurry to help. Afraid that everything belonging to Cale would end up sitting quietly in her own hands. Her Majesty is entering, the herald called out, and the great doors opened onto the light. Boots crossed the red carpet, and every noble in that hall rose at once from their chairs. Everyone be seated, she said, and then noticed what all of them were staring at. A uniform, not a dress. The whispering started before she had even reached the table. The next order of business, she told them, was deciding who would manage the Cale Duchy. A young lord with pink hair and amber eyes looked up sharply from the end of the row. Rather than making it royal territory, she meant to entrust it to somebody else entirely. Given its strategic importance, she preferred lords who had long managed lands of their own. Count Bubail raised his hand and asked, very politely, a question with a knife hidden inside it. Could she not simply administer it as a royal domain under the direct authority of the palace? That was correct, she said. And he guessed she meant to name Witten and Rutherford as candidates. Forgive his boldness, he said, rather than one lord holding such an enormous stretch of territory. Would it not be considerably wiser to have the two of them govern the whole thing jointly? The Western Sea was overrun with pirates, and no single lord could possibly manage it alone. She had not expected help from that direction, and Count Bubail smiled at his own cleverness. If they governed it jointly, then the land would belong to nobody in particular at all. The glory would go to the crown, and the council could scrutinize their every single movement. A fine suggestion, she said. The two of them would be entrusted with joint governance of it. The old count bowed his head, pleased with himself, having just walked straight into her trap. However, she added, and divided the regions of rule with one line drawn by her finger. Split every profit collected from them, half to the crown and half to whoever governs it. Half, somebody repeated faintly from the back of the room, half of Portmire Harbor every year. That was the jackpot, Witten thought, and he fully intended to have it whatever the cost. She would take the western region, the Marchioness announced, since her own land faced the sea. Nonsense, Witten snapped at her. Did she imagine Portmire was some quaint countryside dock? It was a key diplomatic point, he said, and running the place required the proper skills. Which was exactly why she was right for it, she said, and stood straight up out of her chair. She had been first to open relations with Laffy, and she had hosted salons for years. To boast of diplomacy in front of a former ambassador. She was quite amusing, he told her. Diplomacy is done on your own 2 feet, she snapped back, and not from behind a desk. Enough, said the king. Both of them would calm themselves and sit back down in their seats. Portmire, she repeated slowly, and the whole hall leaned toward the map spread on the table. She would think over which of the two to choose, she said, and pushed back her own chair. Until the next assembly, then. She smiled at them the way a gardener smiles at young seedlings. Wait, somebody said from the table. But the meeting was over, and she was already walking away. Black heels crossed the red carpet, and every man there had just been handed enough rope to hang himself. Later, out on a forest road, the sunlight came down through the bare branches onto 2 riders. He was smiling to himself, which was rare enough that she turned in the saddle to look at him. He kept thinking about the looks on those 2 faces, he admitted. Age was making him playful. Age, she repeated, and he realized his mistake approximately 1 full second too late. There was something he wanted to ask her. The Duchy of Cale was an immensely valuable land. He found it genuinely hard to understand why she would entrust it to those 2 people. She reined in under the trees and looked back at him with the light moving across her face. That, she said. Was he curious about it? She liked riding, she told him. It gave her time to organize her thoughts properly. He rode along beside her in silence for a while, working through the arithmetic of it himself. Cale, the likeliest candidate for king, had fallen. Would the lords truly follow whoever replaced him? Yes, of course, he said at once, and she laughed because she had known he would say exactly that. No. They would think of her as a rookie who had been handed a crown entirely by accident. How could they dare, he said, to someone who ended an entire civil war in a single night? The lords almost certainly believed it was Walter who brought Duke Cale down, she told him. In their eyes, he had been a great general already, and she was a child outside the succession. Was she saying that he had stolen her achievement, he asked, and his hand tightened on the reins. It was quite all right, she said. She had guided them toward that conclusion entirely on purpose. What did he think happens if she keeps pretending not to know the ways of the world? The lords would let their guard down in front of her. Exactly, she said. That was the whole point. So she was throwing them a duchy as bait and watching for the moment their real faces show. Were there others who needed expelling besides Duke Cale, he asked. She said. Well, she had met countless people across her repeating lives and had sorted them into two kinds. There were those who showed a different face every time, and those who were always the same. The man riding beside her belonged, without one single exception, to the second kind. In every one of those lives, a castle burned, and he stood in front of it until the very end. Right up to the moment that he died, he protected Parnas from the armies of the Empire. It had been exactly the same in all three of her past lives, without any variation at all. But the other lords, she thought, had proven considerably less consistent than he was. They had been busy running, or surrendering first, or quietly negotiating for their own estates. There had even been one among them who leaked internal secrets, a noble who worked as a spy. She had to check whether that particular person would turn traitor again this time as well. They had arrived, he announced, and she squinted up into the sudden brightness of the courtyard. And there was one more thing she needed to confirm about the man who never changed at all. Their hosts came out to meet them. They had kept Her Majesty waiting, they said apologetically. A white temple stood against the sky with its towers full of slowly circling birds. The temple of the nameless god, with a red carpet running the entire length of its floor. Priest number 61 would guide her, they said, and a young man bowed extremely low. Weiss glanced sideways at the priest and did not entirely manage to hide his own expression. Jen elbowed him hard in the ribs, and both of them received a look from their commander. This way was the chapel, the priest said, leading all of them in under the vaulted stone. Number 61, Weiss repeated. Did the ascetics here genuinely not have any names at all? Those who serve the nameless god sever every worldly tie and erase themselves entirely. That was why they abandoned their names on the very day that they entered the order. Ah, said Weiss, so that would be why the hair as well, and immediately wished he had not. It seemed a concept Arafi would find genuinely difficult to understand, the priest said. Come to think of it, Jen said, he had heard the Grand General's sword came from this temple. Was that true? She asked, and turned around in the aisle to look directly at Walter. Yes, he said, in the voice of a man who had hoped nobody would raise this particular subject. Dawn had been enshrined here as a divine object for generations before he ever touched it. The sword that nobody could hold, left lying down in the temple basement, exactly like this. And then Sir Heiberg lifted it, the priest said, and half the temple had watched it happen. The oracle had said the Master of Dawn would let them hear the nameless god's true name. So the god here has an actual name, Weiss said, and the young priest looked genuinely pained. Why, the boy asked, would anyone on earth be named Nameless? And Jen laughed out loud. You are also called number 61, Weiss pointed out, and the boy stopped laughing at once. When the name returns, the priest said, the god will incarnate and descend upon the world. So the Grand General was the implementer of an oracle, she said, thoroughly enjoying herself. They should hurry along, Walter said, before any more of this delayed the entire schedule. And also, Jen added helpfully, Sir Heiberg's voice was wonderful, and so was his face. Everyone, said Walter, and the corridor went quiet in the way that corridors always do. This was a sacred place, he told them, so every one of them would be silent from here on. She followed him out into a courtyard and stopped, because somebody was sweeping at the far end. It has been a while, she said pleasantly. Duke Cale. And the janitor slowly lifted his head. She had come because she had something to ask him. What could anyone want from a fallen man? She was thinking of entrusting the duchy to Rutherford and Witten under joint rule, she said. What did he think about that? She asked, watching the broom move across the flagstones. He was not interested in any of it, he said, so she should do exactly as she pleased. Everyone knew how much the Duke had cherished that land, from tax reform to public welfare. Was she mocking him right now, he asked, and the smile on him was thin as old paper. Not at all, she said, and behind him the great temple rose up white into the winter light. The doctrine here was selflessness, to neither be bound nor to bind, and to empty yourself. He had decided to follow that doctrine, and letting go had only been difficult at first. Looking back at everything he had erased, he wondered why he had ever lived that way at all. Rebelling against her had been part of it. As his conquest continued, he came to covet a throne. Did he regret any of it, she asked him. He said that he was sorry, but no, he did not. It had been like a tidal wave, he said, feeding leaves into a small fire. It was bound to happen. The throne was empty, there was no heir, and he held both power and authority in his hands. Even if he went back and did the whole thing again, he would make exactly the same choice. He was sorry to her, though. Honestly, he had underestimated her from the very beginning. He had assumed the Grand General meant to install a puppet and seize the power through her. She understood completely. She would have thought precisely the same thing in his position. But that man had needed no such scheme. A single coup would have finished the entire matter. For a man like that to bring her forward as king, she truly was a remarkable woman. It had been a bold strategy. He was not sure she was king material, but she was not ordinary. That was a compliment, she assumed. He said he was a man with nothing, but not a scoundrel. Kale, she said then, dropping every pleasantry at once. She needed him back at her side. Acknowledge her as sovereign and return, she said, and he called her incredibly direct. He should look for somebody else. So she asked whether he was curious about his son. The boy was in a prison cell refusing food and water, atoning for his father's sins. He had always been frail, she added. She truly did not know how much longer he would last. How, the Duke said. How could she use his own son as a hostage for a second time? If she had won that day by just means, he would have praised her with all his heart. But she had already set the board to win, and she chose to use his child regardless. She waited until he finished screaming. He still saw the world only by his own standards. The soldiers he had tried to kill were also somebody's children and somebody's fathers. She had simply found the most efficient way to keep every one of them alive that night. So who exactly was he, she asked, to stand there in a temple and condemn her as unjust? He claimed to have emptied himself of everything, and yet he had a very long way to go. Meanwhile, back at command headquarters, the yard was full of soldiers and ordinary noise. Somebody was carrying a tray of premium black tea down the corridor toward her rooms. Somebody else had set up an elaborate trap in that same corridor, baited and ready to spring. A smooth, fragrant blend with a hint of bergamot, and the maid was extremely proud of it. Her Majesty was going to love it, she thought, right up until the moment of collision. Then Jen came around the corner at full speed and hit that tray dead in the center. A rat sat in the middle of the ruined tea service, apparently considering all its options. "Catch the rat!" somebody screamed, and the entire headquarters lost its composure at once. Boiling tea went everywhere, Wiz was shouting. The rat was winning quite comfortably. "The refreshments for Her Majesty," wailed the maid as the animal went up somebody's skirt. 3 grown officers of the Parnas army chased a single rodent down a marble hallway. Meanwhile, in her borrowed room, the King of Parnas was debating whether to take a bath. She was still debating the question when the door opened without any warning whatsoever. Valter looked at the state of that room and then at her and said absolutely nothing. His eyebrow moved perhaps 2 millimeters, which from him counted as an entire speech. She was going to clean it, she said. She had been just about to do exactly that. It was not her he was worried about, he replied, but the soldiers she was inconveniencing. The palace had been ready for some time now, so he would appreciate it if she left. She dragged her feet around the room and said she simply felt no attachment to that palace. The palace existed to glorify His Majesty, he said. Better to grow used to it sooner than later. Fine, she said at last. She would go once the coronation was finally over and done with. Was she not putting off that coronation, using the Lord's oath of loyalty as a convenient excuse? Was it by any chance because of Gödel Kyle? Over these months he had come to know her. That casual attitude of hers and the way she seemed so oddly careless about everything. But in truth she was methodical and meticulous, and she never once left an opening anywhere. Ever since she came back from that temple she had been downcast, so something had gone badly. Had she really shown it? She asked. Nobody in the world but him would have noticed, he said. Now that he mentioned it, she had been annoyed. She had approached that man perfectly politely. She had gone in with her head down, and he had still made every part of it difficult. Why was she trying so hard to appease Duke Kale? He asked, turning away from the bookshelf. Because nobody else alive could rein in the lords the way that one old man could. His contributions to Parnas were significant, and above all, she needed him for one thing. She needed him to help root out the traitor she already knew was hiding somewhere among them. Did he know what he and Godel Kale actually had in common? She asked. He said he did not. They were both idealists who lived entirely for Parnas, each one in his own separate way. Valter protected the nation with strength, and the Duke had protected it with skill. Even fighting against them, it was obvious the man loved this country more than himself. But the other lords were nothing at all like that. All they cared about was their own land. What about Rutherford and Witten? He asked. Were those two not different from all the rest? She said, and settled deeper into the couch cushions with her eyes already closed. Vanessa Rutherford, popular among the nobles, gifted with genuinely natural political instincts. And Bon Witten, trusted by the elders from a family of loyal retainers for generations. Between the two of them, she asked, who did he personally think was the better choice? If he had to pick, Witten seemed slightly better, since the man spoke for the crown first. I see, she said. Then perhaps she should simply appoint Witten as chair of the council. He stopped because he had realized she was watching him and waiting for the answer. Honestly, he said, neither of them was really chair material. And more importantly than that, would your majesty please step back a little bit? Fine, she said, entirely delighted. Rutherford was in no position to wrangle the elders, and Witten was, well, The lords were badly divided, so no matter who was chosen, there would be complaints anyway. True, she said, and lay back thinking about a board with far more pieces than he could see. Rather than talking every lord round one at a time, winning Kale alone was simply easier. That stubborn old man, she muttered. So how exactly was the Duke's son doing these days? Because of his father, the boy had been researching the nameless god extremely diligently. He was already a known bookworm, and lately he had buried himself even deeper in the texts. A delicate, sensitive son out of a long line of warriors. That was quite a combination. Being a martial house did not require producing a warrior in every single generation. He had never particularly wanted to be a soldier himself, he admitted to the ceiling. He had picked up Aura one day, completed the tasks he was given, and ended up here. Winter came early that year, and the maids pulled the curtains back on a sky full of snow. They ran along the covered walks before any more of it could pile up on the roofs. Inside, a girl had fallen asleep at a desk buried under books, beside an unlit reading lamp. She woke, looked up at the snow through the tall windows, and went straight back to writing. When would His Majesty enter the palace? A viscountess asked over tea. No date had been set. The coronation would wait until the administration stabilized, and it could not be helped. True, judging by the mood in Parliament, there was an astonishing amount of gossip going around. Who should have been king? Who was quietly gathering private soldiers again this winter? Honestly, even after watching Duke Kale fall, none of them appeared to have learned anything. They believed it was not the king who defeated Kale, but the Grand General's own power. That she was merely a woman the Grand General had chosen and propped up on a chair. Gifts were flooding the Heiberg household these days, and one man was trying hardest of all. He was already sending private soldiers toward Portmere, counting his chickens far too early. 2 days later, the council chamber filled again, and every lord bowed as she walked in. Everyone was busy with winter preparations, she said, so they would get straight to the point. She knew the lack of a coronation caused unease, but she asked them for a little more patience. It would be held early next year, at the first sowing season, once the roads were passable. The cabinet was not fully formed, and the neighboring countries were troubling her. Next, the executive branch would be reorganized, and here was the proposed cabinet composition. Next, a proposal to adjust next year's tax rate for the territories with poor harvests. Valter stood at the wall watching her work through it, item by item, without a single note. So that was why she had not been sleeping, and why she had been so deeply focused for weeks. She had been preparing for these meetings the entire time she was pretending to be idle. He straightened his coat and said nothing at all because there was nothing useful to say. Lastly, she said, the matter of the Kale Duchy. And the trap she had spent a month building opened. The key issue was the western coastline, and she had already chosen who would fall for wanting it. She had thought long and hard about what would genuinely be best for everyone involved. And then she had wondered what would happen if they simply changed the premise entirely. The premise, Witten repeated. She had hoped the two of them would cooperate harmoniously, but she questioned whether it was truly efficient for two people to divide one single task. Therefore, she intended to grant one of them the position of Grand Tutor to the Crown Prince, and to entrust the other one with full deputy governance of the entire Kale Duchy, an empty title against the whole western coast. The room did that arithmetic instantly. She had not chosen an heir and was not even married, Witten sputtered. How could there be a tutor? The Crown Prince's tutor was an immensely important role, she said, and she was in good health. An heir would come along before very long, and what exactly was that reaction? How ungrateful. Pardon, he said faintly. She meant him. She had chosen him to raise the future king of Parnas. She recalled that he had once earnestly desired to be tutor to the late Crown Prince, and few men were as wise or as considerate as he was. Truly, nobody was better suited. She trusted him with the child, she said, with one hand resting lightly over her heart. And the duchy itself went to Lord Rutherford before he could get a single word out. That evening, she sat in front of a table covered in cakes she had absolutely not asked for. Your Majesty, he said pleasantly, agitating an adversary like that is fraught with peril. Duke Witten was a deeply devious individual, considerably more so than he ever let on. Turning that particular man into an enemy had been extremely ill-advised, he told her. Ah, she thought, with a cake halfway to her mouth, so that was what the table was for. Was he staging an intervention in order to scold his inexperienced ruler? Was that it? He picked up his own fork and did not answer her, which was answer enough by itself. She had handed the whole duchy to Rutherford and made Witten a tutor with no student. That man had surely taken it as a mortifying, public, and entirely unforgivable insult. After a disgrace like that, his hatred for Her Majesty would only grow, and steadily. She should have asked him beforehand, he said, one word at a time, very calmly indeed. Stop looking at her like that, she finally shouted, and just yell at her instead. He drank his tea. She chewed her cake with the expression of a woman being slowly executed. At last she admitted it. She had antagonized Duke Witten completely and deliberately on purpose. She had sensed she needed to goad him badly enough to force his hand. Force it to do what? Because in all of her previous lives, Bon Witten had always turned out to be the same thing. A turncoat who sold Parnas to the Empire 3 separate times without ever hesitating once. A man who sells his country 3 times is not going to change on the 4th attempt. But she could not punish him for treachery that he had not technically committed yet. So instead she had set a trap that the man would find absolutely impossible to ignore. How would a furious Witten respond? Would he swear allegiance, or would he finally betray her? The problem was explaining any of that to him without explaining how she knew it. Just admit it is her 3rd time living this life, she thought wildly, and discarded the idea. No, that was impossible. And yet she could not simply ignore what she knew was coming. What excuse could she possibly give? How should she phrase it? Oh, to hell with it entirely. This might sound ridiculous, she said, but would he trust her anyway? He said that he would. It was highly likely, she told him, that Bon Witten was acting as a spy for the Empire. To make such a claim, he said slowly, did she hold intelligence that he had never seen? No, she said. It was merely an intuition she happened to have about that particular man. The two of them sat there across the tea table while that sentence hung in the air. Do not look frightened, she told herself. The crazier the story, the more confidence required. Her instincts about these matters were uncannily accurate, she informed him very proudly. He should simply maintain strict surveillance on Witten's movements from now on. Since she was that adamant, he said at last, he would trust her judgment and watch the man. He would restructure the vanguard, and any incident would be answered with the entire army. Elsewhere in the capital, a cart slipped in the crowd and people scattered across the cobbles. What an absolute nuisance, said the man watching all of it from inside his carriage. Then he glanced out of the window at the people standing around in the square below. Blonde hair, clothing from the western desert, and his whole face changed in an instant. That insane little brat, Bon Witten hissed. Her mother was trash, and so was the daughter. She had surely seduced the Grand General with her body as well, he told his aide. Grand Tutor, he spat out. Who would ever want to educate the offspring of a common harlot? His scheme had been to play the devoted retainer and rise as prince consort at the right moment. He had no wife, and he was merely 43. Her pedigree was poor, but she was beautiful. Kale was ruined. Rutherford was busy holding her own lands, and Bubil would die of old age. There was not one person left in this nation worthy of the throne. Parnas was a lost cause, and there is no reason at all to remain aboard a vessel that is already going under. Had they not received a message from the Empire, sent through the Crown Prince's own adjutant? "Instruct them to arrange a rendezvous immediately," he said. His aide bowed and understood. And that blonde girl standing over there. He wanted her hauled back to his estate tonight. She resembled that brat closely enough, he said, so she would do nicely for venting his frustration. There were 4 command posts in Parnas, central beside the capital and 1 each east, west, and south. The north had the twin peaks of Mount Nomen, so nobody had ever bothered to guard that side. Yet beneath that mountain sat a detachment so small it barely deserved to be called a unit. Black boots came down onto the snow, and somebody inside started shouting for all the others. The Parnas 8th Squad, a house built for exactly 12 Rafi at the edge of the world. "How was the unit?" Wyss asked him. "Everyone was fine except the 2 out on assignment." "Was he staying tonight?" "No, only stopping by." His Majesty was alone, so he had to go back. Napari crouched down in the snow and let out a very long breath through his teeth. When would he return to reconnaissance duty, he asked, without looking up at his captain. Since taking that guard detail, he was barely ever here, and his feathers were a mess. He would sleep far better if he stopped using that coolant stone while resting, at least. "Not for a while," Wyss said. "Understood," said Napari, and then said what, rather loudly. It was just that he sounded serious. Before, unless it was the Grand Marshal, he had coasted. "His Majesty," Wyss said, and stopped. Well, he had lived in Pomnos, of all the places on Earth. "Pomnos," Napari repeated. "Not a visit or a work trip. Over 2 years, and he knew his mother. It was extremely rare for a human to survive in the North at all, let alone for that long. And of every place on the entire continent, exactly the same hometown as his captain. Maybe," Napari said with a look of dawning delight, "this whole thing was actually fate. Fate with a human," Wyss said flatly, and started walking back out toward the snow. "Why not?" Napari called after him. He had said he would find his fate outside the North. Someone who overlapped with him this much was not exactly easy to come across in a lifetime. "Worry about his own fate," Wyss told him, and went off to attend to his own. Then somebody came sprinting across the snow screaming that it had finally happened. It was war. Dauphin and Antibasila's main forces had clashed out on the Pell Plains. "Ah," she said in the capital, folding a small piece of paper. So it had finally begun. It had felt like things were about to move, and the next move belonged entirely to her. The man who had run in breathless to announce a war stood in the doorway feeling foolish. His Majesty was always composed. He would devote himself further and learn from that calm. With tens of thousands of soldiers gathered, they could not keep draining resources forever. It had only ever been a matter of time. "But," she added and paused with the scissors. Dauphin struck first," she asked him. "Yes. Then Dauphin was going to win this entire war. Should they begin preparing their own defenses while the 2 nations tore each other apart?" "Did she have a particular reason to be that certain?" he asked. "Yes, a very simple one." She kept on cutting. He waited the way he always did for her to finish the sentence. "Dauphin had fewer soldiers, no better weapons, and no geographical advantage whatsoever." "Then why exactly was she so sure?" he asked, and she finally looked up from the table. "Lycans move fast and see in the dark," she said. "That is why they are used for surprise attacks. The Lycan slaves the Empire sent into Dauphin," he said slowly. "Do not tell him that they had cut Antibasila's supply network with them." She said. "Exactly that. Precisely that. Attacking a supply line is basic strategy, but the Pell Plains leave absolutely nothing hidden. Blocking that supply gorge would have made ordinary men easy arrow fodder from the heights. But with Lycans it worked. And in the end, wars are won by whoever manages to last longest. Everything matched up. The Empire's secret aid and Lycans sent instead of Imperial soldiers. A standoff begun after the harvest, and the first strike launched just before the spring. "See," she said, going back to her paper. "Simple." And he had thought himself good at strategy. "Since when?" he asked, staring at her across the room. Since when exactly had she known this? "Only speculation," she said, embarrassed. "The real genius was whoever devised the plan itself." And she knew precisely who that was. Prince Alex, the crown prince of the Empire. "Anyway," she said brightly, folding paper into a standing picture. "This one was for Walter." He took the folded paper picture from her hands as though it were a relic out of a temple. It was hard to call the thing splendid, even as flattery, but his liege had made it herself. He stood there in the light, holding a child's paper craft, and could not speak for a while. Something happened to his face that he would have denied under any form of torture. It was nothing grand enough to call a proper return gift, he said, but he had something too. He pressed a small gray stone into her palm with an enormous amount of seriousness. She looked down at it and then up at him, and her whole expression changed at once. This was no ordinary stone. It had skipped across the water 7 times and come back to him. He had always kept it on his person, he said, so please would she accept it from him. She turned away from him with her shoulders shaking and both hands clamped over her mouth. Why was she laughing? He asked. Was it disappointing? If she disliked it, he would take it back. Meanwhile, at a White House under a heavy sky, a very different conversation was ending. Von Witten sat by the window watching his guests leave through the tall iron gate. A man in white came in through that gate as the carriages pulled away down the drive. Your Excellency seemed to have enjoyed the conversation very much, the aide observed. Conversation, he said. It was the same tired political talk that it always was. If his face looked pleased, that was thanks to the toy he had left up in his bedroom. The woman's condition did not look good, the aide added. Should he prepare another similar one? More importantly, how went the war? The prevailing prediction now was that Dauphine would win. Antibasila's supply route had been cut, and their soldiers were surrendering in droves. Good grief, Witten said. He had been absolutely certain that Antibasila would take it. Truly, the world never ceases to surprise a man who thinks he has already seen everything. 500 years ago, one country split into Antibasila, Dauphine, and Parnasse. Ever since that division, Antibasila had been overwhelmingly superior in national power. In the end, you never really know anything at all until you crack it open and look inside. He would be meeting the crown prince soon, he said, and the aide stopped moving entirely. The prince was coming in person, but the meeting place had to be somewhere out at sea. Because of the Rafi Corps, the aide assumed, those creatures carried messages through the air. All because of those filthy pigeon brats, Witten muttered and lit his pipe with a candle. If the Empire was sending an envoy this openly, then they had an agenda of their own. Swallowing Parnasse whole for one obvious example, and he had entirely made peace with that. Once the date was set, have a ship ready to leave Portmeyer without drawing any attention. It was the only route to the Empire, so they would slip through the strait very quietly. And about bringing in a similar woman, he added, forget it. He would soon have the real one. He could not wait to see that impudent face of hers smeared all over with tears. Far away, in a mansion full of roses, that same impudent face was enjoying a hot bath. He wanted her to monitor the harbor, the Marchioness repeated, in complete and total disbelief. Every single ship passing through Portmeyer without missing even one of them, ever. Not only the ships docking there, she said, every vessel that passes through those waters. That would not be easy. She was a greenhorn governor. Who at that harbor would obey her? She would send Rafi soldiers, the king said. Let them watch the whole coast from the sky. She would entrust such important troops to her. They only needed to finish and come back. It should not take very long at all, she said, and sank deeper into the hot water. The steam rose, the rose petals turned slowly, and the Marchioness studied her guest. She had wondered why the king suddenly arrived at her mansion asking to bathe together. Was she worried about eavesdroppers? Yes, it is dangerous when there are ears about. Anyway, the Rutherford bath was luxurious. It could not be compared to headquarters at all. Was that perfumed oil? Oil from western desert roses, apparently, with an exquisite scent. May she ask the reason behind such an order? Did it perhaps concern Duke Witten? She liked people like her, the king said. Say one word to them and they understand 10. Was he planning something by sea like Kale? Would he move when he was bound to lose? Strange visitors had been coming and going at House Witten lately, an antique dealer from the Empire. So he was plotting treason. There was only suspicion and no proof, and finding it was her job. Weiss walked into the drawing room and found the King of Parnasse sprawled across a sofa. How many times had he told her not to lie about like that, and in the Rutherford estate? It had been ages since she soaked in a proper bath, she said. She would like a pillow, too. She was still damp and would catch cold. Just 5 more minutes, she mumbled into a cushion. Bergamot tea, said the Marchioness, coming in with a tray. Please rest well, Your Majesty. Her Majesty had saved her daughter's life. This, she said, was nothing at all by comparison. She had heard the eldest daughter was as wise as her mother and would enjoy meeting her. Oh my, really? If she called for her, the girl would come running this very instant. There was also a child who wished to meet her alongside the daughter, the Marchioness added. She did not have to go that far, the king began, and the Marchioness had already gone. It was the young Marquis Las, the servant announced from the doorway of the room. Young Marquis Las, she repeated, and remembered a red-haired cadet running laps in the sand. Hey, Arsino, he bellowed, coming through the door with both of his arms in the air. Something white moved across that room faster than anybody present could actually follow. How dare he carelessly utter Her Majesty's name, Whis said from on top of him. Whis, calm down, she said. It was all right. He should let the young Marquis go now. He had clearly been attempting an assassination. No, she said, he was her friend. They were close enough for that, she said, and did not mention how few friends she had left alive. She had thought Raffi only flew, he gasped. At least she would never be assassinated. He really had not changed at all, she said, sitting back down again with her tea. He was a marquis now, and his manners were terrible. He said she was a king and still spoke like that. A red-haired girl in glasses bowed neatly and introduced herself as Kokush Rutherford. Might she excuse herself briefly before asking after Her Majesty's health, she asked. She was looking at Geronimo. Young Marquis, she said sweetly. Would he please stand up? No, he said. He was not going. He had already been lectured to death on the way here. What he said now represented House Las, unlike the years he spent living like a delinquent. Honestly, Geronimo said, he had never once imagined that girl would become a queen, and she had never imagined she would be talking down to the young Marquis Las. If he came to Parnas, she added, he might have reported that he was alive first. If he had known, he said, he would have helped her from the very beginning of all this. She had been too busy keeping herself alive to ask anybody at all for help, she told him. Still, thank you for lending her troops against Duke Kale. Then what about compensation? She had just given it. Lady Arsinoe's sincere and heartfelt thanks. Kokush hit him. She apologized for all of the rudeness, and the king told her not to worry about it. She had heard much about her wisdom, and that the Marchioness consulted her on affairs. Kokush flushed and said Her Majesty was the one who stopped a rebellion with strategy, and who had saved her life at a point when she had entirely stopped expecting to survive. She had wanted to meet her for so long, and now she was even more amazing than imagined. Amazing! Geronimo shouted. Kokush would regret it deeply if she started liking that woman. Someone like her would be devoured in the blink of an eye, he insisted, and got hit again. And if Geronimo even thought about going after Kokush, then the two of them were finished. That was not the point right now, Geronimo whispered. The girl liked her, genuinely liked her. This one, he added, has absolutely zero sense when it comes to matters of romance. Here, she said, pushing a plate of cake toward him. Eat up and cheer up, my friend. Later, she stood on the steps outside while the two of them went on arguing indoors. What an absolute mess, she said, entirely delighted, and walked down into the winter garden. The pale light fell across the hedges, and for one moment she had nothing at all to plan. Then something cold touched her hand. Why on earth was it raining in the middle of winter? And out of that cold gray sky, a pair of white wings came down toward her very fast. Stay close to him, Whis said, and put one wing between her and the freezing winter rain. Did the Raffi not hate getting rained on? She asked, looking up at the feathers above her. Of course they did, but the recon unit scouts in every weather, so they had gotten used to it. No matter how hard the rain fell, it never reached the down, so honestly, it was fine. They walked back together across the wet path toward the lights of the mansion. Then he shook out his wings, and she received the entire contents of them across her face. She had bathed a moment ago, she said, with that precious rose oil. It was deeply unfair. The next morning, in a small chapel, a young man sat reading beside a tall window. Atland Kale, the only surviving son of a trader, with a theological text open on his knees. She had heard his vision was impaired, she said, but reading seemed to be no trouble at all. He came out of that chair so fast that he very nearly dropped the book on the floor. He greeted Her Majesty. One eye worked perfectly well, he explained, so reading was fine. Sit down, she said. She would like a moment of his time. Of course, he answered her. She sat across from him and studied the face of the boy she had once held at knife point. A theological text on the nameless God? His father was at the temple, so he had grown curious. Godel Kale was doing well, she told him. He said letting go had made him feel at ease. His father adapted quickly to reality, Atland said, so he was probably genuinely at peace. That was a good trait, she said. She was petty. When somebody wronged her, she could not sleep. Atlin Kale, she said then. She would ask him directly because she disliked wasting time. Did he resent her? The one who brought his father down and took the throne for herself? He looked at the floor for a long moment before he lifted his head to answer her. That was what he wanted to ask, he said. Did Her Majesty not resent every one of them? If she did, she said, she would not have let him live. So she had no reason to resent him. Then let the two of them make peace, she said, and he asked her to please repeat that. She needed Godel Kale, but the man still disliked her, so she wanted help turning him around. He wanted her to persuade his own father, he said. That was precisely what she wanted. Even a traitor's past accomplishments do not simply disappear, she told him plainly. He had never embezzled out of greed, and never used his connections to corrupt politics. She was praising his father, who had harbored treason. He could not tell if she was serious. No matter how brilliant she was, she said, she could not navigate this world alone. A captain may keep a ship afloat, but it is the crew who steers her across the water. And his father had the power to unite that crew better than anybody else alive today. Above all, she added, Kale still needed to atone properly for his own rebellion. He seemed to be living rather leisurely at that temple, and it was making her jealous. She needed to work his father a great deal harder, she said, entirely delighted with herself. He was not sure the man would listen even if he tried, Atlin said very honestly. Then somebody set a carefully wrapped bottle down on the table between the two of them. Tempt him well with that wine, she said. His father was a drinker and would know its worth. Atlin looked at the label on it, and his composure came apart completely. Tell him that if he comes to her, she will give him 100 cases of exactly that. 100 cases. Then she would look forward to good news, she said, and rose to leave. Wait, he said. Was Her Majesty really just going to leave him standing here like this? Wyss stepped forward with a chain in his hands and an entirely neutral expression. What exactly was this? Atlin said, and then his feet left the floor of the chapel. My lord, somebody shouted from the doorway. Wait, just one moment, please, just one. The temple of the nameless god stood quiet under a gray sky an hour or so later. Inside it, a former duke was sweeping a corridor and thinking about absolutely nothing. Atlind, the former duke shouted, dropping his broom. What on earth had brought him here? He had never once imagined that he would see his own son again in this life. He was not certain himself, Atlind admitted. Her Majesty had left a Rafi behind at the estate. And that Rafi had suddenly dropped him. Well, brought him. There was a meaningful distinction. That must be the captain of the Rafi unit, Kale muttered. What was that woman plotting now? Still, said his son quietly, he was happy to see him. And that much at least was true. Let him look at him properly, Kale said. Had anybody been beating the boy in secret? Then he noticed the wrapped bottle that his son had been carrying the entire time. What was that? Atlin did not drink much, so he was not sure of the details, but still. Was that not the legendary wine that only grows in Adelnos, the coldest Rafi city alive? The very wine his father used to open only on genuinely special occasions. Yes, that was right, Kale said slowly. And how exactly had the boy come by a bottle of it? Her Majesty had given it to him herself and told him to bring it here to his father. And if he agreed to follow her, she would provide another 100 cases of the same wine. This was not something even the powerful could easily obtain. She must think he was nothing. Did his son believe he would change his mind over some wine? He demanded, sweating heavily. Even though he loved wine, Atlind agreed. His father was not a man swayed by such things. Damn it, said the former Duke of Kale, and put his face into both of his hands. Why this wine, of all the wines on the continent? What a genuinely ruthless woman. So he had simply accepted it and carried it here. The wine itself was innocent, was it not? Wyss had packed it for him, Atlind added, and poured out a cup of it anyway. His father watched the red climb up the side of the cup and swallowed exactly once. 2 hands lifted that golden cup, and neither of them said anything at all for a while. Wine like this, and the son he had been missing? It was, he admitted, truly wonderful. Enough, in fact, to make the woman who had sent him seem not quite so terrible after all. When somebody offers you forgiveness, Atlin said, perhaps a person ought to accept it. They were in no position to be high and mighty about it. Of course not, they were traitors. If he were king, Kale said, he would have taken every head, useful or entirely otherwise. Then why was he being so stubborn about all this? His son genuinely did not understand. Because he was frustrated. Losing was bitter enough without obediently taking orders too. That was all of it. His son told him he was remarkably childish at moments like this. When you get old, you become childish, Kale said. Just wait until he was old himself. To go to such lengths persuading a traitor. That woman was no ordinary person at all. The late king and that concubine had both been utterly ordinary people in every respect. He could not fathom how a daughter like that had come out of a king like him. The right person in the right place, as they say, whether you mean people or things. Right, he said at last. He was not cut out to be a temple janitor after all. Non-self or whatever they called it here. Even playing at being a monk it never took. All day long he thought only of his territory, of Parnasse, and of the state of the continent. He could not give his son the world that he had promised him all those years ago. But perhaps he could still help to build a slightly kinder one before he died. Father, said Atland, and Cale looked up at him with the cup still in his hand. She had very boldly promised 100 cases of that wine, he said, half to himself. Let us see, he added, whether that woman's word is actually worth anything at all. Elsewhere, the laundry was drying in a bright winter yard behind the headquarters. Done, Jen announced to the sky with the enormous satisfaction of a very simple man. Vacation was coming soon, somebody shouted across the yard. They should all go and eat meat. He needed to go and see Her Majesty first, he said, straightening his collar as he walked. Was that outfit not a bit cold? Jen asked his commander in the corridor a while later. He did not even have any fur. Walter said. It was rather chilly for autumn. Excuse him, Jen said. Grand General. It was very nearly the end of December already. He must be truly busy. Right, Walter said. It was almost the new year, was it not? He had been informed that most women find hiking disagreeable, Walter said very carefully. Furthermore, Her Majesty loathed physical exertion to a genuinely extreme degree. Oh, come on, Jen said. That was not always the case. It builds up your stamina, for one. And he had heard his own father went mountain climbing while courting his mother. They say romance blooms on a battlefield because people mistake a racing heart for love. Was hiking not exactly the same principle? Jen demanded, warming to his own theme. You climb until you are exhausted and your heart is pounding, and then your eyes meet. And suddenly the mood turns, he said, into, that. He failed to understand what was being implied. He and Her Majesty were not romantically involved. Jen stared at him. He was frankly baffled that anyone would even conceive of such a notion. How could he possibly view his liege, whom he serves with undying loyalty, in that light? Then why, Jen asked him, had he gone to those lengths? All of it, purely out of loyalty. Was there truly nothing at all going on between them? A regrettable misunderstanding, he said. Building stamina indeed, Jen muttered, and gave up on the entire conversation at once. Mountaineering was a most wholesome pursuit. It disturbed no soul and squandered no resources. It required not a shred of another person's toil, and it offered nothing but benefits. Still, he wondered whether Her Majesty would genuinely find any part of it agreeable. Then he arrived at her door and found her asleep on the couch beside the Marchioness. He was just in time, somebody said inside. Your Majesty, permission to enter the room. It had been quite a while, Sir Heiberg, said the Marchioness from her chair by the fire. What brought her here? She simply had something to present to Her Majesty, she said. Witten had taken the bait, said the king, without opening her eyes at all. He stood very still in the doorway while the two women waited for him to catch up. They had confirmed that the merchant frequenting Witten's estate was an imperial agent. And yesterday, one of the Duke's galleons had docked at Portmire disguised as a traitor. Did it not seem blatantly obvious, she asked him, exactly who the man intended to meet? It was too soon for conclusions, he said. They had no concrete proof of imperial involvement. True, the odds were 50-50, and bad luck would let Witten turn the investigation on them. However, she said, he should trust her instincts on this one particular matter. She might not know what goes on inside a good man's heart, but she knew how a villain thinks. Instincts, Walter thought, with the expression of a man watching a cliff edge approach. But that aside, he said, the real problem lay somewhere else entirely. Witten was cunning, and by now he had certainly realized that he was being watched. They had to seize the man at the precise moment of contact, and the question was how. The rendezvous would be near the border or inside imperial waters, so no army could go. Precisely. One wrong move and they would hand the Empire an entire diplomatic incident. Their objective was to brand Witten a spy, not to start a war they were not ready for. Then how, he asked her, did she propose that they catch the man in the act itself? She looked up at him from the map with an expression he had learned to genuinely dread. General, she said, by any chance at all, did he happen to enjoy fishing? 2 days later, at Portmire Port, a very old man sat happily on the dock with a rod. He had fully expected another hiking suggestion. What brought Sir Heiberg to the water today? Well, knowing how much the Count enjoyed it, Walter said, and did not finish that sentence. Senior Count Bubel, mountain worshipper, fishing connoisseur, and linchpin of the elders. He was not getting a single bite, and it hardly mattered since he had come for the company. You must bring the Count along, she had told him. He would make the perfect witness. Forgive me, Count, Walter thought, watching 3 birds cross the sky. That was the signal. Far out on the water, a small sail was already moving steadily toward the open sea. That was the signal, said the Raffi overhead, and turned back toward the harbor front. Count, this did not seem to be a good spot at all. They should move somewhere else. Said Bubel, gathering up his tackle. Well then, let us go and find somewhere better. A flag went up from the dock crew. All set. That, the Count thought, was remarkably fast. Was he planning to head out to open sea, the Count asked, watching him walk down the pier. Yes. Look here, if they wanted open water, they should have left at the crack of dawn. It was well past noon. How exactly did he intend to secure a boat at an hour like this? The vessel had already been prepared, Walter said, and the Count blinked slowly at him. Wait, a boat. Why was there a boat? Were the 2 of them genuinely going out to sea? Please take his hand, Walter said, and hauled a very confused old man up the gangplank. Miles away, a different boat was carrying a very different passenger through the swell. This thing rocked like absolute hell, Bon Whitten complained, and the stench was even worse. With plenty of decent ships available, why had they picked this one, of all things? It was best to resemble a common merchant vessel, his aide said, in order to avoid suspicion. And when exactly were they going to arrive? Another 20 minutes, apparently. Tell them to move faster. It was already maximum speed because the water was so calm. He was suffering every foul indignity imaginable, he said, entirely because of that girl. They would be at the rendezvous point shortly, somebody called down from the mast. And there it was, the Empire's galleon, enormous, gilded, and about as discreet as a bonfire. Good grief, Whitten said. Did they have any brains at all in that country of theirs? They had gone through hell keeping this meeting secret, and the Empire sailed up in that. Come aboard quickly, an Imperial officer called down. The Crown Prince was waiting for him. A ladder, Whitten muttered. It was hard work just to see that Crown Prince brat's face. Then a shout went up from the deck, and everybody started running in different directions. What on earth were they babbling about, he demanded, and turned to look at the water. Out past the swell, a small sail was coming toward them at an entirely improbable speed. What was that ship? And why was it heading straight at them across open water? Helmsman, the Imperial captain was screaming, "Get away from here right now, immediately." Somebody stop that ship, Whitten was shouting. Wait, they were going to crash. He said they were going to crash, and then the little boat hit the galleon amidships. What kind of nonsense was this? He howled from the deck, soaked through and furious. Something swung down out of the rigging and Imperial sailors went into the water. He could not swim, one of them screamed. Should he jump as well, screamed another. What in the world was that Crown Prince doing? He was supposed to be saving him. Was everybody all right over there? Called a voice from the wreck of the fishing boat. He had been so absorbed in his fishing that he had made an absolutely terrible blunder. His deepest apologies. He would, of course, compensate them for all of the damages. That voice, Whitten said, and every drop of blood went out of his face at once. Oh my, said the Grand General of Parnas, lowering his spyglass. Was that not Duke Whitten? And that ship, judging by the design of it, that was very clearly a vessel of the Empire. Beside him, Senior Count Bubel slowly realized precisely what he had been dragged into. Good heavens, said the old man, right here in the border waters of all the places. Just what exactly, Walter asked across the water, did the Duke believe he was doing? Duke Whitten established a collusive relationship with the Empire and leaked the secrets of Parnas. For those crimes he had been imprisoned, and a public trial would be convened at once. Attendance was mandatory. Duke Whitten, a spy? Did that make any sense at all to anyone? Think how long that house had been loyal, they said. Others remembered his rage over the tutor. Even so, a public trial. Was there truly any need for the crown to go quite this far? Had everyone gathered, she asked, walking into a courtroom full of the most powerful men alive? Then let them begin. Bring the man in. So tell them, Duke Whitten, who exactly do you serve?